Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we dive fork first into the gritty underbelly of Roman cuisine. Not the feasts of emperors draped in silk or the wine-drenched banquets of marble villas. No, tonight we're creeping down alleyways and past smoky street vendors to find out what the everyday Roman, especially the poor, actually ate to survive. Spoiler alert, it wasn't always pretty. In fact, some of it was downright revolting. But these were meals crafted out of necessity, not taste. Survival, as you're about to see, sometimes demands a strong stomach and an even stronger sense of humour. And if you're squeamish, well, they probably wouldn't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The sun hangs low over the cluttered tenements of Subura, a dense and chaotic neighbourhood in ancient Rome. Down here, away from the polished stone of the Forum and the imperial gardens, food is less about delight and more about endurance. A mother stirs a steaming pot over a modest fire. What's in it? You don't want to ask, but your nose already knows. It's a medley of boiled barley, a hint of sour goat milk, and possibly, yes, a dried mouse tail. For the urban poor, daily survival depended on ingenuity. Their meals were built from scraps, leftovers, bruised vegetables, and whatever animal bits the market stalls couldn't sell. A common go-to, pulse. This basic porridge, made from spelt or barley, could be bland or borderline traumatic depending on what got tossed in. Sometimes it was enhanced with wild greens or onions. Sometimes it came with a surprise, like the occasional weevil. Of course, not everyone in Rome had the luxury of weevils. Rural peasants had to deal with even leaner pickings. Their diet might consist of lentils, stale bread soaked in vinegar, and a bit of foraged food if they were lucky. Mushrooms, for example, were a big gamble. The tasty ones looked suspiciously like the deadly ones, and unfortunately Pliny the Elder didn't publish field guides with illustrations. Historians still argue whether poisoning from mistaken mushroom foraging was truly common, or just a favourite urban legend of the Roman elite. Now let's talk water. Clean drinking water wasn't exactly flowing freely from every aqueduct. Sure, those grand arches carried pristine streams into the city, if you were rich enough to tap into them. But for the average Roman, water came from public fountains, often fouled by runoff, waste, and the occasional dead pigeon. That's why sour wine, or posca, was a preferred drink. A concoction of vinegar, water, and herbs. Posca was what soldiers and labourers gulped down to stay hydrated. It was tart, rough on the palate, and smelled faintly of despair, but it did the trick. Roman generals even encouraged their troops to drink it. Some claimed it built character, others just appreciated the mild disinfectant properties. One mainstream historical fact worth savouring here is that despite the poverty, Romans cared deeply about food. They just couldn't afford good food. Markets bustled with fragrant spices, but those were priced for aristocrats. Olive oil, precious. Honey, a luxury. Most Romans sweetened things with defrutum, reduced grape must that was dark, sticky and cloying, and sometimes spiked with lead to improve its flavour. Yes, lead. It's one of those Roman culinary choices that modern scientists point to with a deep sigh and a knowing shake of the head. And then there's the grain dole, a lifeline that was both a blessing and a bureaucratic mess. Under the Annona system, eligible citizens received regular distributions of grain, a kind of ancient welfare. But this wasn't premium quality wheat. We're talking old dusty sacks often full of grit, pebbles and the occasional rodent dropping. People didn't complain much. They cleaned what they could, ground it down and made their humble loaves. These were hard, dry and best eaten with something wet, like that infamous fish sauce we'll get to in a moment. But imagine chewing through a slice and hearing a crunch that shouldn't be there. Could be a rock, could be a bug. You swallow and pretend it's extra protein. Speaking of bugs, fringe historians love to point out the presence of insects in the Roman food chain, not necessarily on purpose. Food storage wasn't airtight. Grain silos attracted pests, and bonus larvae wasn't printed on the packaging. But over time, a kind of tolerance developed. Some Romans likely accepted that a little added crunch was just part of the experience. In fact, archaeological digs at Herculaneum and Pompeii have revealed traces of insect parts in preserved bread samples, confirming what people already suspected. Roman food was often shared, with many legs. Still, not every Roman was miserable. Even the poor occasionally celebrated. Festivals brought meat to the masses. When temples slaughtered animals for religious rites, the non-sacred portions, think hooves, tails and organs, were sometimes distributed to the public. These cuts were boiled into stews or grilled over makeshift braziers. The smell of offal cooking in alleyways might not sound pleasant, but after months of barley mush, it was a feast. Some foods, while disgusting to modern ears, were treasured in ancient Rome. Snails, for example, were a delicacy. Wealthier Romans had snail farms, yes, tiny gastropod plantations, where snails were fattened with milk and wine before being roasted. Occasionally, a snail or two found its way to a plebeian's plate. Rare, but when it happened, a minor miracle. Now let's pause for a moment to appreciate the Roman sense of humour. They had one. Satirists like Juvenal and Martial loved mocking the food of the poor. One joke involved a man so poor he could only afford to season his stew with the memory of garum. Another scoffed at a widow who thought stale lentils were gourmet because they'd been aged 3 winters. The elite loved to sneer, but these jokes also reveal how intimately food reflected class in Roman life. And here's a fun fringe tidbit. Some Romans believed that eating certain foul foods could make you stronger. Fermented dairy, fish heads, even animal testicles were thought to imbue vigour or sexual potency. A common soldier might choke down something revolting not because it tasted good, but because a local healer told him it would help grow chest hair or win a wrestling match. Modern medicine disagrees, strongly, but perhaps the most humbling detail is this. Despite their culinary creativity, the poor in ancient Rome lived with constant hunger. Malnutrition was common, children were stunted, bones brittle. Rickets left its mark on skeletal remains, and signs of scurvy appear in ancient dental records. People didn't eat disgusting food because they wanted to. They ate it because they had no choice. And yet, they survived. Not all, not always, but enough to keep Rome growing, to keep streets bustling, and to pass along these tales of culinary grit. Even now, 2,000 years later, we still taste echoes of their world. Think of polenta, born from ancient pools, or bagna cauda, the garlicky anchovy dip of northern Italy, probably a garum descendant in disguise. So next time your toast falls butter side down, or your soup tastes a little bland, take heart. You're not picking beetles out of your bread or sipping vinegar water from a rusty ladle. And remember, even when food got disgusting, the Romans made it work, with humour, resourcefulness, and occasionally a truly unfortunate mousetail. The alleyways still reek of smoke and sweat as the morning sun warms the narrow paths of Subura. But today, a stronger scent wafts above the rest, a smell that can only be described as rotting ocean meets vinegar-soaked laundry. That, dear listener, is garum, and whether you lived in a tenement or a villa, chances are it's on your lunch. Garum was the Roman answer to ketchup, if ketchup were made by fermenting the entrails of fish in clay vats under the sun until they liquefied into salty goo. It was, quite simply, the most ubiquitous condiment in the empire. The rich used it to flavour oysters and duck. The poor, they used it to make old bread and porridge slightly less soul-crushing. Roman cookbooks, yes, they had those, mention garum in nearly every recipe. It was that essential. To make garum, workers layered fish guts, salt, and sometimes whole small fish and giant amphorol. These were then left out in the hot sun for weeks, sometimes months. Nature did the rest. Bacteria broke the mix down into a pungent slurry, which was strained and bottled. The result was golden, oily, and potent, loaded with umami and more than a little questionable bacteria. It wasn't just popular, it was an industry. Garum factories dotted the coastlines from Spain to Syria. The town of Pompeii, before it was buried in ash, had several garum production sites. Imagine the smell. The process wasn't just stinky, it was brutal. Workers endured the putrid fumes day in and day out. Slaves and labourers did the mixing, the straining, the bottling. It wasn't glamorous, and sometimes they got it wrong. Batches spoiled, grew mould, or turned a shade of green that even desperate Romans knew to avoid. Still, when done right, garum was liquid gold. So prized was this fish sauce that there were multiple grades. The highest quality was called liquamen, clear and light in colour, often reserved for the tables of aristocrats. Then came the darker, chunkier versions, basically fish sludge for the less fortunate. Even the dregs were bottled and sold, nothing went to waste. Mainstream historians agree that garum's popularity is unparalleled in Roman cuisine. But here's a twist. Garum wasn't just for food. Romans used it medicinally. Got a sore throat? Gargle with garum. Skin infection? Rub some on it. Dog bite? Slather that fish juice over the wound and hope for divine intervention. Some physicians of the time swore by it. Others, understandably, kept their distance. And then there were the Roman perfumes. Yes, you heard that right. Certain beauty products contain trace amounts of garum mixed with herbs to mask the odour. Historians still debate whether this was seen as exotic or if it was the ancient version of a really bad prank. Now let's zoom in on a cramped kitchen inside a Roman taberna, where a cook is preparing a typical lunch for the shop's regulars. On the menu, lentil stew with leeks, barley cakes, and a generous splash of garum. He dips a ladle into a clay jar and dribbles the amber liquid over the bubbling pot. Instantly, the aroma intensifies. One customer nearby sighs contentedly. Another coughs and pinches his nose. It's a love it or hate it kind of thing. For the poor, garum was a lifeline. When meat was unaffordable and vegetables were wilted, it brought depth and salt to every dish. A stale crust of bread dipped in watered-down garum could pass as a meal. A thin gruel became hearty with just a teaspoon of the stuff. Some even drank it straight, especially if mixed with wine and herbs. Think of it as a Roman Bloody Mary, minus the tomato juice, and plus, well, liquefied sardine guts. Quirky fact time, there were actually Roman garum sommeliers. Okay, not officially, but certain merchants developed reputations for producing high-end garum, and bottles from specific regions, like Betica in Spain, fetched premium prices. Amphorae were stamped with maker's marks, brand names, and even catchy slogans. Picture Felix Garum, pure joy in a jar, in Latin script. The branding game was strong. Garum's influence stretched far beyond Rome. Roman legions carried it across the empire. Archaeologists have uncovered garum amphorae in Britain, Gaul, and even along the Danube frontier. It was global before globalization was a thing, but the recipe didn't stay the same everywhere. Local variations popped up. In North Africa, for example, garum was sometimes mixed with date syrup or honey. In Egypt, it may have blended with pickled lemon. These regional tweaks gave rise to debates about what real garum was, making it the ancient equivalent of today's authentic pizza arguments. Let's not forget the hazards. Improperly made, garum could cause food poisoning. Amphorae cracked, moulds grew, batches went sour. The lack of refrigeration meant storage was risky business. The lower classes buying bargain bin garum from street stalls had no guarantees of freshness. If the sauce made you ill, too bad. Refunds weren't part of the Roman marketplace. And yet, garum persisted for centuries. Even after the fall of Rome, its essence lived on. In modern Southeast Asia, fermented fish sauces like nampla and nuoc mam bear an uncanny resemblance. Some food historians argue that garum may have inspired them, spread via trade routes or cultural osmosis. Others think it's a case of parallel evolution. Either way, the legacy of fermented fish endures, and so does the love-hate relationship with its unforgettable aroma. Now, back to the streets of ancient Rome. A young apprentice, dirty from a morning hauling olive oil, slouches onto a stoop and unwraps his lunch. Inside, a hunk of bread, an olive pit, and a small wax-sealed jar. He peels it open carefully. Inside glistens a murky brownish liquid. He tears the bread, dips it, and chews thoughtfully. It's tangy, it's fishy, it's satisfying. He wrinkles his nose but doesn't stop. Hunger has no pride. Historians still argue whether garum was truly as beloved as records suggest, or whether its ubiquity simply made it unavoidable. Was it genuinely tasty, or just the only thing masking the taste of slowly rotting barley and limp cabbage? The answer might lie somewhere in between. One thing is certain. Garum was deeply embedded in Roman identity. Poets referenced it. Playwrights joked about it. Doctors prescribed it. Soldiers carried it. Cooks worshipped it. Slaves endured it. And emperors probably had the high-end stuff decanted tableside with silver ladles. And here's a fringe curiosity for the night. A few ancient recipes for garum included not just fish, but other ocean ingredients, like sea urchins or jellyfish. These batches were rarer, and likely used in specific regions or for religious rituals. We'll never know exactly how they tasted, but they probably weren't winning any modern food awards. By twilight, the city's kitchens wind down, fires dim, amphorae are resealed, and garum pots are tucked away until breakfast. But the smell? It lingers. In the clay, in the air, even in your clothes. Once you've worked with garum, the scent clings to you like a second tunic. But for millions of Romans, that smell meant comfort, flavour, and survival. So next time you wrinkle your nose at a pungent cheese or a fermented tofu cube, remember, there once was a civilization that revered rotting fish guts as the height of culinary innovation, and they might have had a point. Sort of. Evening settles over the eternal city, casting a dusty gold light over its rooftops and market stalls. Down a quieter lane, behind a half-crumbled wall and a sagging wooden fence comes a faint rustle. It's not a thief. Not exactly. It's dinner, on the hoof, or more accurately on the scamper. A chubby rodent squeezes under a crate, whiskers twitching, and somewhere nearby someone licks their lips. In ancient Rome, rodents weren't just pests, they were food. Yes, really, and not in some theoretical famine-only apocalypse kind of way. For many Romans, especially those looking to stretch a few sestertii or impress a guest with exotic tastes, certain rodents were a staple of the menu, chief among them the dormouse. The dormouse, or glis, was no sewer-dwelling rat. It was a plump, sleepy tree dweller, prized for its tender, fatty meat. Rich Romans, believe it or not, bred them. In special terracotta jars called gliraria, dormice were kept cosy, well-fed, and plumped up for the table. Picture a rodent spa/prison. They were fed acorns, chestnuts, and honey, and left to grow fat in the dark, where they would instinctively prepare for hibernation, fattening themselves naturally. Genius, if you don't think too hard about the ethics. But dormice weren't only for the elite. In the countryside, hunting them was a common activity. Children learned how to trap them, and farmers viewed them as both a nuisance and a potential stew. They could be roasted whole, stuffed with nuts and herbs, or turned into a pâté-like spread. The meat was rich, slightly sweet, and mild, according to the ancient version of Yelp reviews anyway. Of course, not all Romans saw this as normal. Some considered dormouse eating to be decadent, even vulgar. The historian Pliny the Elder mentioned them with a raised eyebrow, as if to say, "Really? We're eating that now? Where?" But in a society where flamingo tongue and jellyfish salad graced imperial tables, a juicy dormouse hardly seemed outrageous. That said, not every rodent on the Roman menu came with pedigree. Field mice, for instance, were more of a desperation snack. Found scurrying in granaries or wheat fields, they were smaller, gamier, and often less hygienic. Still, a hungry family might catch, skin, and roast them with wild herbs over an open fire. The resulting dish was meagre, bony, and perhaps more psychological comfort than culinary treasure. You didn't eat it for the taste, you ate it because it was there. Then there were rats. Now, let's be clear. Romans didn't widely consume sewer rats. Those were feared, reviled, and blamed for illness. But black rats, smaller and cleaner, occasionally found their way into stews, especially during hard winters or under siege. Modern stomachs may clench at the thought, but for ancient Romans, survival sometimes meant drawing fewer lines between animal and ingredient. Historians still debate how widespread rodent consumption truly was. Was it a regional habit, a quirky elite indulgence, or a normalised part of the peasant diet? The archaeological evidence is patchy. Bones of dormice show up in trash pits and latrines across the empire, including in Britannia, suggesting that the practice travelled. But whether people enjoyed eating them or simply tolerated it is harder to pin down. One confirmed fact is that dormice were a status symbol. At elite banquets, they were often served as delicacies, drizzled in honey and poppy seeds, arranged delicately on silver trays. A kind of Roman hors d'oeuvre, albeit with tiny feet. Their presence signalled wealth, worldliness, and a bit of theatrical flair. After all, what says I've arrived quite like serving your guests plump woodland creatures stuffed with pine nuts? Quirkier still is that some Romans believed dormice had medicinal properties. Crushed dormouse fat was used in salves for earaches. Some claimed eating their brains improved memory, although that may have been ironic humour even back then. Others swore that dormouse stew aided digestion, which is either a bold claim or a mild cry for help. Let's step into a humble Roman farmhouse on the edge of Campania. A father is preparing dinner while his children chase a few rodents from the corner. He's caught 2 dormice today, one plump, the other scrappy. He skins them with practised hands, seasons them with herbs he foraged along the road, maybe oregano or rue, and stuffs them with a few crushed hazelnuts and stale breadcrumbs. The family will share this meal with barley cakes and perhaps a single olive each. It won't be enough, not really, but the meat gives them a sense of normalcy, a reminder of feast days, of better times. Now contrast that with the other end of society. In a marble villa, a reclining senator smirks as a silver platter is unveiled. 5 roasted dormice, each wrapped in grape leaves and resting in a puddle of fig syrup. A musician plays softly in the background. Slaves pour wine. The senator gestures with theatrical pride. "Behold my exotic course!" The guests nod politely, chew thoughtfully, and whisper to each other about how the ones in Alexandria are far better, because naturally they have opinions. Here's a curious fringe detail for the dreamers among us. In some parts of the empire, dormouse motifs appeared in children's toys. Tiny clay dormice curled up to sleep were sold as trinkets. Perhaps this reflects the creature's dual role, as both pet and platter. Children might have loved them for their cuteness, adults for their calories. The line between disgust and delicacy in Rome was ever shifting. What one class considered humble fare, another dressed up as luxury. What one region rejected, another embraced. This flexibility kept the empire's bellies full, if not always happy. And remember, the average Roman didn't enjoy culinary abundance. Most meals were repetitive and bland, so when something as rich and flavourful as a roasted dormouse came along, it felt like a revelation. A greasy, crispy, slightly wild-tasting revelation. One that might still twitch faintly in the memory long after the bones had been sucked clean and tossed into the hearth. Of course, not every Roman had the stomach for it. Satirists mocked the trend, scoffing at the elite for their rodent feasts. Imagine a Roman version of late-night comedy. So, I walk into this banquet, and what do they serve me? A rodent, stuffed, with nuts. I said, "Thanks, but I already had dinner in my granary." The audience groans, the poet smirks. The dormouse, well, it doesn't get a vote. So next time you're tempted to judge a civilization by what it eats, remember this: one man's vermin is another's delicacy. And while the idea of roasting dormice might send modern stomachs turning, for ancient Romans, it was just Tuesday. Dawn breaks with a cool breeze slipping through the ancient alleyways, where soot-darkened windows rattle, and a chorus of hungry bellies begins its daily groan. On a backstreet corner, a child squats beside a communal oven, waiting for his family's pot of barley gruel to finish cooking. It bubbles slowly, thick and beige, flecked with specks too small and too twitchy to be seasoning. When it's ladled out, someone crunches loudly. They glance down. It's another beetle. Welcome to one of the most common meals in ancient Rome for those scraping by. Barley gruel, known as pulse when you wanted to sound fancy, or boiled glue when you didn't. Made from barley or emmer wheat, sometimes thickened with lentils or chickpeas, this dish was the culinary wallpaper of Roman life. It filled the stomach, warmed the bones, and delivered just enough energy to carry stones, herd goats, or argue with neighbours. That is, until the grain ran out. Grain was the lifeblood of the Roman diet. Without it, civilization stuttered. But the supply wasn't always steady. Droughts, wars, piracy, and mismanagement of the Annona system could leave city storehouses depressingly bare. And when the grain dole faltered or delayed, panic simmered just beneath the surface. Families scavenged, stretched rations, and yes, sometimes started mixing in less ideal ingredients. There are written complaints, real, grumpy, and oddly timeless, about adulterated flour. Millers, especially in tough times, padded out their product with ground-up leaves, sawdust, powdered beans, or even clay. When baked, the resulting bread had a chalky aftertaste and a suspicious crunch. It kept people alive, but also wore down their teeth, literally. Archaeological evidence from Roman cemeteries shows extreme dental wear, often blamed on stone grit from rudimentary grinding wheels and perhaps the occasional surprise pebble. Insect infestations were another plague. Food storage in ancient Rome was an open invitation to beetles, moths, and weevils. Grain was kept in large amphorae or bins, sometimes underground, but ventilation and sealing were laughable by modern standards. Once pests took hold, they multiplied quickly. The result? Your barley porridge might come with extra squirm. Still, the Romans adapted. Some even learned to live with it. A half-boiled beetle might be annoying, but it was also a tiny boost of protein. No one tossed the pot out because of a few insects, at least not the poor. The rich could be pickier, of course. They had slaves to sort and clean their ingredients. The poor had fingers and prayer. Here's a juicy mainstream historical tidbit. During several famines under Emperor Claudius, grain prices soared so high that barley became more valuable than meat. Bread riots erupted in Rome more than once. Not over politics or taxes, but because someone ran out of loaves. The most feared word in the Roman Forum wasn't assassination, it was shortage. Meanwhile, farmers in the countryside got creative. When harvests were thin, they foraged. Roots, tubers, and bitter greens joined the stew pot. Wild nettles were common, boiled until they stopped burning your mouth. Acorns were sometimes ground into flour, though they had to be leached of their tannins first. A long, tedious process that involved soaking, boiling, and more soaking. Skip a step and your bread came out bitter enough to double as punishment. And then there were the oddball recipes. Barley boiled in leftover wine dregs for a hit of flavour and colour, or spelt mixed with crushed snails, cooked until it resembled a slimy grey paste. No one was submitting these to the De Re Coquinaria, the Roman cookbook attributed to Apicius, but they kept bellies from aching. let's not ignore the psychological toll of food monotony. Eating the same thing day in and day out wears down more than your molars. It flattens your spirit. So Romans flavoured their barley mush however they could. Wild onions were a favourite, as were leeks, garlic and herbs like thyme and rue. If you were lucky, or resourceful, you might even score a drizzle of oil or a bit of cheese rind to melt into the gruel. Luxury? Not quite. But morale boosting? Definitely. Now, a quick detour into Roman humour. Juvenal once mocked a man for serving barley gruel at a funeral banquet, calling it better suited to goats. Another writer claimed that eating barley daily turned a man into a donkey. Perhaps not the most original insult, but when your dinner was soft, grey, and shaped like a hoof print, the comparison wasn't too far off. Still, the use of barley as a primary foodstuff was not unique to Rome. Across the ancient Mediterranean, barley was common among soldiers and slaves. In fact, Roman gladiators were sometimes called hordearii, barley men, because their diets emphasised this humble grain. This has sparked debate among scholars. Some argue the barley-based regimen gave them stamina and bulk, while others suspect it was just cheap and filling. Either way, it's proof that even the blood-soaked stars of the arena weren't exactly dining in decadence. One of the more fringe, slightly odd dietary theories held by ancient doctors was that barley cleansed the soul, or at least the stomach. Some medical texts suggest barley gruel acted as a purgative both literally and spiritually. Eat enough of it, they claimed, and you'll be free of dark thoughts. That might have been true, assuming your thoughts were all about wanting different food. In desperate seasons, barley wasn't just eaten, it was worshipped. Offerings to Ceres, goddess of grain, often included barley cakes, simple discs of ground grain, pressed into shape and baked on hot stones. These were left at shrines or tossed into sacred fires with whispered prayers. Please, bring rain. Please, let the harvest not suck this year. Imagine a crumbling tenement where a mother stirs her pot by flickering lamplight. She hums a lullaby to soothe her baby, who's gnawing on a wooden spoon. Dinner tonight is thin gruel, seasoned with wild thyme and one crushed olive. It's not enough, but it's warm. And in a world where war and disease loomed outside every window, warm mattered. Now zoom across the city, to a public grain mill powered by a mule circling endlessly. The air inside is thick with flour dust. A line of poor citizens waits with sacks and hope. They mutter complaints, compare pest infestations, and swap tips on boiling rat bones for extra flavour. A young man swears he saw a toad crawl out of a grain sack last week. Nobody's surprised. They just nod and clutch their satchels tighter. Here's an open scholarly debate for you. Some archaeologists argue that ancient Romans intentionally included certain fillers, like ground legumes or bran, to increase the bulk of their barley rations. Others believe these were accidental byproducts of hasty milling and lax quality control. Either way, the result was the same: bread and porridge that never tasted quite the same twice. Over time, even the wealthier classes came to associate barley with poverty. Wheat was for elites, barley was for the desperate, and while a few eccentric physicians might praise it as healthful, nobody requested it at dinner parties. By the late Empire, barley had become almost shameful, a food you hoped to outgrow. Still, the barley endured. Season after season, war after war, rain or drought, plague or peace. The humble pot of barley gruel bubbled on Roman hearths from Britain to Syria, from Africa to the Alps. It fed children, soldiers, farmers and gladiators. It filled funeral bowls and temple altars. It shaped jaws, dulled taste buds, and hardened resolve. And sometimes it crunched when it shouldn't. The sun rises sluggishly over Rome, dragging golden fingers across rooftops and temple columns. In a cramped physician's chamber that smells faintly of herbs and feet, a healer fans the smoke from his brazier and reaches for his most trusted remedy. Not honey, not vinegar, not a whisper of crushed pearl. No, today's miracle cure is cabbage. That's right, cabbage. In ancient Rome, this humble vegetable wasn't just a side dish. It was medicine, myth, and mild torture all wrapped in one leafy bundle. Roman doctors praised it, housewives boiled it, and philosophers extolled its virtues with the kind of fervour we now reserve for superfoods and green smoothies. According to Cato the Elder, cabbage could cure practically everything. Got a hangover? Eat cabbage. Feeling feverish? Boil it with wine. Trouble in the bedroom? Rub cabbage juice on your limbs. And if you happen to have a festering wound or aching teeth, you guessed it, cabbage poultice. Cato even claimed that Romans wouldn't need Greek doctors if they just trusted cabbage. A bold claim, especially considering Roman dentists were about as gentle as a goat with a chisel. The reality? Cabbage was everywhere. It grew easily, stored well, and tasted functional. When fresh, it had a bitter crunch. When boiled, it turned limp, sulphurous, and vaguely gelatinous. Overcooked cabbage wasn't just unpleasant. It was a full-on assault on the nostrils. Even Romans, with their robust fish sauce tolerance, made jokes about cabbage houses and the unfortunate smells that lingered in their wake. But there was logic in the madness. Cabbage is high in fibre, rich in vitamin C, and a natural diuretic. It's also cheap. So when money ran low and the grain dole thinned, cabbage became both food and filler. Mixed into stews, stuffed into flatbread, or simply boiled into oblivion, it filled stomachs across the empire. Now for the quirkier side. Some Romans believed cabbage could prevent drunkenness. Before a night of wine-soaked revelry, diners were encouraged to nibble a few raw leaves, or down a cabbage salad with vinegar and salt. The theory was that cabbage absorbed wine, acting as a sponge in the stomach. How well this worked is, shall we say, highly debated, but the tradition persisted. There are even tales of soldiers chewing cabbage before battle, hoping it would grant clarity, sobriety, and somehow bravery, or at least a less embarrassing hangover. Here's a curious side effect they didn't discuss quite as openly. Cabbage made people gassy. Impressively so. Roman bathrooms weren't exactly soundproof, and communal latrines left little to the imagination. One satirical poet even described the experience of sharing a bench with a cabbage enthusiast as a war of wind. Still, Romans valued the cleansing nature of the vegetable. Better out than in, they said, though not always in polite company. And cabbage wasn't just for the plebeians. Wealthier households prepared it more delicately. Braised in oil, flavoured with herbs, and often served as part of an appetizer course, it was a marker of frugality cloaked in refinement. Cicero himself reportedly enjoyed pickled cabbage, though whether that's a sign of taste or desperation is unclear. Let's step inside a busy Roman kitchen. A servant chops a mound of cabbage, the knife thumping rhythmically against the stone counter. Steam curls from a clay pot where cabbage simmers with garlic and a drizzle of spoiled olive oil. A child sniffs the air and grimaces. "Again?" she murmurs. The mother shrugs. "It's what we have." Tonight's dinner will be cabbage stew with barley crusts and maybe, if they're lucky, a scrap of goat cheese. Meanwhile, in a physician's chamber across town, a man winces as fermented cabbage paste is applied to his bruised shoulder. The healer mutters about inflammation and balance while his patient tries not to gag. It smells like old socks and regret. Fringe medical practices didn't stop at poultices. Some Roman texts describe cabbage smoke being used to treat breathing ailments, literally setting cabbage on fire and having the patient inhale the fumes. Soothing, the texts claim. Unbearable, the modern nose counters. One doctor even prescribed cabbage seed oil as a cure for baldness. Judging by the sheer number of statues featuring smooth-domed senators, that one might not have panned out. And still, cabbage endured. Its presence in Roman agriculture was practically eternal. Farmers loved it. It grew year-round in many parts of Italy, required little fuss, and could even regrow from trimmed stalks. During shortages, families guarded their cabbage patches like treasure. It wasn't glamorous, but it was survival. One mainstream fact that scholars agree on: cabbage played a major role in Roman dietary structure, particularly among soldiers and the working class. Marching rations often included dried cabbage leaves or fermented slaw, easy to carry and resistant to spoilage. Even gladiators reportedly ate cabbage stews to maintain bulk. Not muscle exactly, more like sheer presence. After all, size intimidated. If cabbage made you gassy and bloated, well, maybe that was part of the show. Let's not forget cabbage's role in Roman festivals. At Saturnalia, when roles were reversed and slaves dined like masters, cabbage often appeared as a comic feature. "See," the elite joked, passing bowls of the stuff. "Even we eat humble food now." Of course their version was simmered in imported spices and presented with fig syrup, but the message, however diluted, was there. Cabbage is for everyone. Yet for all its medicinal claims and comedic moments, cabbage was ultimately a food of necessity. It kept the poor alive and the sick somewhat hopeful. It left its mark on stomachs and social commentary alike, and it stayed in the Roman diet longer than some emperors stayed on the throne. Here's a charming visual. A street vendor on the outskirts of the city hawks cabbage pies, shouting over the din of carts and goats. His pies are misshapen, crust cracked, steam rising from cabbage and leek filling. A child begs for a bite. The vendor slices a sliver with a grin. "He'll be strong as an ox," he declares. The child wrinkles her nose, chews cautiously, then goes back for more. In the world of ancient Rome, where food often mirrored status, cabbage was the great equalizer. It filled pots in tenements and villas alike. It played doctor, chef, and comic relief. And even as the empire expanded and imported new delicacies, the cabbage stood its ground. Firm, crunchy, slightly smelly, but deeply, undeniably Roman. So the next time you push away a plate of steamed cabbage, remember this. It once carried an empire through sickness, famine, and questionable parties. It was chewed by philosophers, worshipped by doctors, and feared by dining companions. And yes, sometimes it made people fart so badly they were asked to leave the bathhouse. Some legacies are written in marble, others in cabbage steam. As dusk settles over Rome, the flickering lights of oil lamps begin to dot the homes of the weary. In one cramped room, a man sharpens his knife with a slow, deliberate rhythm. On a wooden slab lies a goat's stomach, empty, cleaned, and waiting. Tonight dinner will be blood sausage, if the meat hasn't spoiled, or maybe a stew of intestines and garlic. If your appetite's already twitching nervously, well, welcome to one of the more visceral corners of the Roman dinner table. In a city where fresh meat was expensive, rare, and often reserved for festivals or sacrifices, Romans learned to prize what others might discard. Offal, organ meat, intestines, stomach lining, blood, wasn't just acceptable fare, it was foundational cuisine. If a beast was butchered, nothing went to waste. Every sinew, every chamber of the heart, every last slippery tube was repurposed for a meal. Gruesome, perhaps, but practical, unquestionably. Let's begin with the Roman love of sausage. The Latin word lucanica referred to a spicy pork sausage, said to have originated from the Lucanians in southern Italy. Slaves from that region introduced the technique to Rome, and from there it spread like a culinary wildfire, especially among the working class. But meat for the filling was in short supply. So what did people use? Everything else. Goat intestines were cleaned, stretched, and tied off at one end. Into them went a mixture of chopped liver, spleen, fat, onions, garlic, pepper, and blood. Lots of it. Blood acted as a binder, thickening the mix and giving the sausage its rich, dark hue. Once tied, the sausages were boiled, then pan-fried or grilled over open flames. Eaten fresh, they were warm, savoury, and, if prepared properly, surprisingly delicious. When prepared improperly, however, the results could be explosive. Spoiled blood turned quickly in the Mediterranean heat. Without refrigeration or precise knowledge of bacterial behaviour, a badly aged sausage might cause stomach cramps, vomiting, or worse. But hunger rarely left room for fear. A sausage that smelled okay was probably fine, right? One mainstream historical note. Roman soldiers often carried blood sausages during campaigns. Salted and dried, these were a reliable source of calories and could be rehydrated with wine or water. They were easy to store and offered a morale boost after a grueling march. The fact that they sometimes doubled as bait for stray dogs, just a bonus. But the obsession with innards didn't stop at sausages. Tripe, cow stomach, was simmered with chickpeas and mint. Lung was shredded and served with sour vinegar sauces. Even kidneys, often soaked in wine to mask their pungency, were roasted on skewers and eaten like street meat. Some recipes combined multiple organs into what could only be described as Roman haggis. Boiled in a sheep's stomach, stuffed with chopped entrails, breadcrumbs, raisins and herbs. Still, not all Romans were fans. The elite viewed offal as crude. To them it smelled of poverty, back alleys and cook fires fueled with dung. But during hard times, say a bad harvest or a citywide meat shortage, those same elites quietly joined the queue at butcher stalls, haggling over hearts and hooves like everyone else. Here's a quirky fringe fact. Some Roman households used dried intestines as musical instrument strings. Yes, seriously. Catgut was common for lyres and other plucked instruments, so your dinner leftovers could, in theory, accompany your poetry recital later. A bit grim, certainly. Efficient? Absolutely. Let's zoom in on a bustling Macellum, Rome's open-air meat market. Amidst the scent of raw flesh and sawdust, a vendor hawks goat tongues and pig ears. Children peer at piles of entrails, wrinkling their noses. A cook haggles over a bundle of sheep intestines, sniffing to gauge their freshness. A slave, clutching a few coins, selects 2 chunks of ox liver and a jar of vinegar. Tonight's stew will be rich, if the meat holds until sunset. Back in a tenement kitchen, a woman scrapes congealed blood into a clay bowl. She mixes it with leeks and stale bread soaked in broth. Her husband's face tightens as he watches, but he says nothing. He'll eat it. They always do. What about taste, you ask? Roman recipes often tried to mask the natural flavour of offal. Garum, vinegar, and strong herbs like lovage and coriander were frequent companions. Mustard was a favourite, especially when paired with liver. One popular preparation involved slow-boiling cow tongue in wine and garlic, then roasting it until crispy. The result was chewy, pungent, and, as Pliny once wrote, not for the faint of palate. Historians still argue whether these dishes were enjoyed out of genuine preference or bitter necessity. Did Romans develop a taste for intestines, or just learn to tolerate them? Ancient literature gives mixed signals. Some authors mocked those who devoured offal with zeal. Others described these dishes with mouth-watering detail. Perhaps, as with modern cuisine, it came down to preparation. A well-cooked blood sausage was a treat. A spoiled one was a tragedy. It's also worth noting that Roman religious rituals often left large amounts of non-sacred animal parts up for grabs. After an animal was sacrificed, its entrails were sometimes distributed among temple staff or sold to the public. So offal became, oddly, a kind of holy leftover. You could eat a piece of tripe that once lay on an altar if you didn't mind the symbolism. Now for a particularly odd belief. Some Romans thought eating animal lungs would strengthen their own. Soldiers recovering from illness were fed lightly grilled lung, sometimes seasoned with honey and mint. There was no science behind it, just a kind of hopeful mimicry, the idea that strong organs begot strong organs. Not all fringe medicine in Rome was cabbage-based, after all. A curious contradiction persisted in Roman thought. Offal was both vulgar and virtuous. Vulgar, because it smelled and reminded people of death. Virtuous, because it was honest, humble, and embodied the spirit of thrift. Philosophers wrote entire diatribes about the moral decay of a generation that refused to eat liver. What sort of man, Seneca supposedly grumbled, refuses a kidney yet sips wine from a golden cup? Indeed. In the countryside, these dishes weren't merely survival food, they were tradition. Harvest festivals often featured blood stews and roasted hearts. Villagers would gather, singing and telling stories as a bubbling cauldron of pig's head soup steamed at the centre. Children chased each other with charred ribs, elders toasted with watered-down wine, and the offal was consumed proudly, even joyfully. Still, as Roman culinary trends evolved, offal began slipping down the social ladder. Imported delicacies, peacock, camel, exotic fish, took centre stage at aristocratic feasts. Meanwhile, the old sausage and tripe dinners became punchlines. Satirists like Martial mocked hosts who served spleen with parsley as if it were delicacy. Yet in crowded streets and smoky kitchens, the smell of blood sausage never really went away. Let's walk through a late-night tavern in the Transtiberim district. The fire burns low. A pot simmers with garlic, onions, and something dark red and bubbling. Patrons hunch over wooden tables, dipping hunks of bread into their bowls. The flavour is iron-heavy, meaty, unctuous. No one complains. This is the taste of home. Strange, maybe, but familiar. One last image. A young couple in a backroom apartment. He carves slices of kidney with care. She lays them on a hot stone to cook, fanning the smoke away from their sleeping child. They eat in silence, save for the occasional cough and clink of clay dishes. It's not luxury. It's not comfort. But it's nourishment. It's life. So the next time your grocery list includes just the basics, consider this. For ancient Romans, the basics often meant liver, lungs, and leftovers that didn't dare ask for refrigeration. They boiled, fried, and seasoned what they could. They gagged sometimes, but they ate, they endured, and occasionally they smiled, mouths full of goat intestine and garlic. A bitter wind whistles through Rome's narrow streets as twilight creeps across tiled rooftops. At a modest roadside stall, a vendor scrapes the last few loaves from a wooden tray. They're misshapen, crusted with ash, and hard enough to require a chisel. He doesn't offer them with pride, he offers them with resignation. Tonight's bread is the same as yesterday's, stale, sour, and possibly mouldy. But it's all anyone can afford. In a city that once prided itself on the flowing bounty of its grain supply, it's a sobering truth. Roman bread could be absolutely terrible. At its best, fluffy, fresh, golden, it was a triumph of the communal bakery. At its worst, dry, crumbly, crawling with mould, it was a quiet, daily reminder that Rome's greatness wasn't equally shared. The poor, who relied on the grain dole or the cheapest street loaves, often got the short end of the oven. Their bread was usually made from coarse flour, pounded by hand and mixed with whatever would stretch the dough. That might include bean flour, old lentils, or even powdered brick in dire times. Yes, brick. Red dust added texture and colour. Flavour, not so much. Mould was an inevitable villain. With no preservatives and uneven baking conditions, loaves spoiled fast. In summer heat, green and black fuzz bloomed within a day or two, but food waste was a luxury few could afford. A mouldy loaf was cut open, the worst patches scraped away, and the rest dunked in water or posca until it softened. If your teeth didn't chip on the crust, you were having a good day. Let's not pretend wine made things better. For the poor, wine wasn't the sweet, sun-ripened nectar served in bronze goblets. It was sour, acrid, and probably diluted several times. Often, it had been sitting open in amphorae for weeks, oxidized, tangy, sharp enough to peel paint off a fresco. Romans called this bottom-barrel drink a cetum, basically vinegar. But even vinegar wine had a purpose. It cut through the rough flavours of spoiled bread. It made old lentils palatable. And it was safer than much of the water, which might carry anything from algae to animal droppings. Posca, the vinegar-water mix, became the hydration standard of the Roman military and working class. It stung the throat, but at least it didn't give you the runs. Usually. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Many ancient Roman bakeries, especially in Pompeii, doubled as mills. Slaves or animals turned massive grindstones to pulverize grain, which was then sifted and baked on site. The result? The fast bread for fast lives. But the flour often contained fragments of the millstone itself, microscopic grit. Over time, this wore down teeth until molars looked like cracked marble, flattened, grooved, and crumbling. Eating bread slowly destroyed your ability to eat bread. We step now into a cramped kitchen lit by flickering lamplight. A woman hacks at a dense, weeks-old loaf. It shatters into chunks like pottery. She gathers the pieces into a clay bowl, pours vinegar over them, adds a bit of crushed garlic, and waits. It's a poor man's stew softened with time and necessity. Her husband arrives from a day labouring at the baths. He sits, he eats, he doesn't ask questions. Meanwhile, in a senator's villa, the story is different. Bread arrives freshly baked, soft as pillows, infused with milk or honey. Bakers in elite households might add eggs, spices, even imported cinnamon. Bread was sculpted, braided, and presented like art. If it began to stale, it was toasted and served with cheese or meat. Spoiled? Never. The cook would be flogged. Of course, these luxuries were reserved for the few. Most Romans had only one option: public bakeries. Communal ovens, often operated by the state or private contractors, churned out mass quantities of loaves. Citizens could bring their own dough and have it baked, or buy pre-made rounds. Each loaf was stamped, literally, with a mark to show ownership, origin, or the name of the bakery. These stamps are still found today, preserved in volcanic ash, bearing names like Sila or Ophelus. But even these loaves weren't guaranteed safe. Rats nibbled on cooling bread, insects laid eggs in sacks of flour, ash from the oven sometimes settled onto the dough, baking into the crust. When you bit down, you might taste salt grain or something grittier. Here's a quirky fringe theory. Some archaeologists believe certain loaves were deliberately overcooked to preserve them longer, essentially creating edible bricks. These could be stored for weeks or even months, then softened with water or broth when needed. Portable, durable, unpleasant. Think of it as the Roman hardtack. And bread wasn't always round. Sometimes it came as flat sheets, layered with oil and herbs. Sometimes it was rolled into twists mimicking pretzels. On feast days, sweetened versions were made with dates and honey. But most of the time it was just bread. Stale, bland, and necessary. Now let's talk waste. Because the Romans, despite their ingenuity, struggled with food preservation. Without refrigeration or airtight storage, bread spoiled fast. Vinegar could only do so much. When loaves turned green, many households crumbled them into porridge, hid them under lentils or fed them to animals, but those without livestock sometimes consumed them anyway, clinging to the hope that boiling or roasting would kill the mould. Spoiler alert, it often didn't. Still, food laws tried to help. Some emperors instituted regulations against adulterated flour and corrupt bakers. Penalties ranged from fines to public flogging. But enforcement was lax, and bakers often bribed officials. The result? The poor got what they got, and complaints usually ended with a shrug. Let's walk into a bustling insula, a Roman apartment block. In one upper room, a mother cradles her baby while trying to break bread crust with her knee. In another, an old man grates stale bread over his thin broth, hoping the crumbs will thicken it. Down below, a neighbour toasts old loaves directly over the fire, filling the room with the scent of near-burnt flour. It's not a bakery, but it's the closest thing most of them will ever have. And now, a touch of poetic irony. Romans revered the goddess Ceres, patron of grain. Temples dedicated to her gleamed with white marble, filled with offerings of bread and flour. But in the shadow of those temples, people gnawed on mouldy crusts, praying for enough wheat to last the week. Some scholars argue that the symbolism of bread, its role as both sacred offering and daily necessity, created a kind of culinary double standard. Bread was worshipped, but not necessarily respected. The elite praised its symbolism, while the poor just needed it to not kill them, and let's not forget satire. Roman writers loved to poke fun at bad bread. One comic poem describes a loaf so hard it cracked the floor when dropped. Another tale tells of a baker who sold loaves stuffed with pebbles to add weight. Juvenal, always the grump, quipped that a wise man knew not to chew too fast, lest he lose a tooth to the baker's economy. But behind the jokes was a real anxiety. Bread was survival. When grain shipments were delayed, due to weather, piracy or politics, the city trembled. Riots flared. Politicians made promises. Bread prices were monitored more closely than border defences, because an empire could withstand invaders, but it couldn't withstand hunger. So next time you walk past a forgotten heel of bread or wrinkle your nose at a day-old roll, remember, for millions of Romans, that stale, crusty lump was everything. It fed their children, it anchored their prayers, and it sometimes doubled as a dental hazard. In the grand mosaic of Roman life, amid marble columns and silken togas sits a mouldy loaf, unremarkable, uneven, and absolutely essential. A sharp clang echoes through the Roman marketplace as a baker's assistant drops a dented amphora onto the ground. Its dusty contents spill into a basket. Flour, or what passes for it these days. Not quite white, not quite clean, and definitely not quite just flour. Welcome to the dubious world of Roman bread fillers, where creativity and deceit often shared the same wooden spoon. When times were good, Roman bread was a reliable blend of grain and water, perhaps with a touch of salt or oil. But when grain supplies ran thin, or when unscrupulous millers got a little too entrepreneurial, the recipe evolved. To stretch flour farther, bakers and merchants added everything from ground beans to sawdust, from powdered marble to actual bone meal. If it could be crushed, mixed, and baked into a passable loaf, it had potential. Ashes were among the more common fillers. The leftover soot from wood fires was fine enough to mix with flour and often passed unnoticed by hungry customers. Ash added bulk, darkened the bread slightly, and, if you were lucky, didn't ruin the flavour entirely. Some Romans even claimed a bit of ash was good for digestion, or at least that's what the bakers said when questioned. Then there were crushed bones. Animal bones were burned, ground to powder, and folded into dough to mimic fine flour. The gritty texture was a giveaway, but again, hunger tends to quiet complaints. Plus, the added calcium probably didn't hurt, unless you counted the dental damage. Archaeological remains of Roman teeth often show severe abrasion, likely from biting into bread that contained tiny rock or bone particles. Bread may have sustained the people, but it also slowly wore down their smiles. Let's take a detour through a public bakery in the city's lower quarter. It's a busy morning. A line of slaves and day labourers wait for their daily loaves, noses twitching with the scent of yeast, smoke, and something vaguely metallic. The baker wipes his brow and lifts hot bread from the oven, stacking it on a charred board. One loaf has a greyish hue, speckled with what looks like sand. He shrugs and passes it along. In desperate times, even more bizarre additives entered the mix. Crushed tree bark, dried weeds, and even clay were all used to bulk up flour. Bread made with these substitutes was barely edible, often bitter or strangely chalky. But it provided mass, weight, and the illusion of nourishment. A full stomach doesn't always mean a well-fed body. Here's a mainstream fact. Official records show that Roman officials frequently investigated bakery fraud. Laws were enacted to prevent dishonest practices, and penalties range from fines to the public shaming of bakers caught cheating their customers. Despite this, the rules were often ignored, especially in poorer districts where inspectors rarely bothered to tread. And of course, no Roman filler list would be complete without plaster. Yes, actual construction material. Some bakers skimmed off powdered gypsum from nearby sites, mixing it into flour when supplies were low. It helped dry out overly moist dough and gave bread a firmer crust. It also, unsurprisingly, gave people stomach aches, and possibly kidney stones. Historians still argue about how widespread the practice was, but fragments of gypsum have been found in carbonised bread loaves at Pompeii, suggesting it wasn't just urban legend. Now imagine a street vendor hawking fresh bread on a noisy Roman avenue. "Still warm from the oven?" he cries, holding up a cracked, misshapen loaf. A passerby eyes it skeptically, noting the odd texture. Still, he pays. At home, he breaks it open and finds a streak of what looks like charcoal. He sighs, tears off a hunk, dips it in watered wine and eats in silence. Villas weren't only for survival, they were also a sign of social stratification. Wealthy Romans didn't tolerate adulterated bread. Their loaves were made from fine white wheat flour, sifted and milled to remove every impurity. These breads were fluffy, fragrant, and often enriched with milk, oil, or honey. Served at feasts, they symbolized refinement and status. Meanwhile, the poor gnawed on sour, gritty lumps that occasionally crunched with mystery. One particularly fringe practice involved the use of sand. Yes, plain old beach sand, as a filler. While likely not widespread, there are scattered references to bread that crumbled oddly between the teeth, and several preserved loaves show signs of fine, particulate contamination. Whether this was intentional or simply poor storage hygiene is unclear. Either way, it's safe to say sand does not belong in your sandwich. Still, Romans found ways to cope. Bread crumbs from these inferior loaves were often toasted and used to thicken soups. Soaked in oil or vinegar, they became a sort of spread or dip. When mould overtook a loaf entirely, it could be cut away, and the rest turned into stuffing for vegetables or roasted meat. Waste was a luxury no one could afford. Now here's an oddball debate. Some scholars propose that Romans may have tolerated, even preferred, certain additives in their bread not just out of need, but taste. The theory goes that bitter flavours, gritty textures, and sour notes became so familiar that they acquired a sort of nostalgic comfort. After all, taste is cultural. And when your baseline diet is bland porridge and vinegar water, even the crunch of crushed lentil husk might seem like variety. Let's step into a tenement rooftop garden, where a woman kneels beside a small clay oven. Her dough is flecked with bits of ground chickpea and powdered leaf. She shapes the flat rounds by hand and slaps them onto the hot stone. Smoke curls up, stinging her eyes. These breads won't win prizes, but they'll feed her children. She lifts the first loaf, tests the bottom, and smiles faintly. It's not ash this time, just barley. Bread fillers weren't limited to Rome either. Across the empire, from Gaul to Judea, bakers faced the same shortages and made the same choices. Regional variations included spelt hulls, acorn meal, and even ground olive pits. Each added its own texture, flavour, and questionable nutritional value. And each reminded the eater that the empire's bounty was not as boundless as promised. Of course, during festivals and public distributions, real wheat loaves were sometimes handed out to the masses. These rare gifts of pure bread were treasured, shared among families, and occasionally saved for special meals. Children cradled them like toys. Old men wept over their softness. The experience of eating clean, white bread, free of ashes, bones, or mystery grit, was almost spiritual. Here's a callback worth chewing on. Remember the cabbage-fueled farts from earlier? Well, pair that with bread full of beans, and you've got a whole Roman apartment block sounding like a brass section. Communal latrines weren't just social spots. They were acoustic theatres of the lower-class diet. So what does it all say about Roman society? That food was survival, not luxury. That flavour was often sacrificed for fullness. That ingenuity frequently walked hand in hand with deception. And that the simple act of breaking bread could reveal a universe of inequality, invention, and quiet desperation. Imagine one last scene. An old man sitting on a marble step near a crumbling forum. He holds a half loaf in his lap, its crust uneven, its crumb packed tight with something. He nibbles carefully, wincing once, then dipping the bread into a clay cup of vinegar. He chews, he swallows. He stares out at the marketplace where the smell of freshly baked wheat loaves floats tantalizingly out of reach. But he smiles anyway. He's eaten worse. So the next time you grumble about store-brand bread or sigh at a dry crust, remember, at least it doesn't crunch like gravel. And it probably doesn't contain ashes from your neighbour's cooking fire. Unless, of course, you're doing Roman cuisine authentically. The morning haze settles like a damp wool blanket over the hills outside Rome, where a tired shepherd trudges down a narrow path, a sloshing clay jar in hand. Inside, milk, or rather, the best attempt at milk that could survive a Roman summer without turning into something that screams when you open the lid. It's thick, clumpy, and carries the unmistakable tang of sheep that have spent a little too long in the sun. Welcome to the world of Roman dairy. Sour, suspect, and always a gamble. In theory, milk should have been a comfort food. Creamy, rich, and versatile, it had the potential to transform a meagre meal into something indulgent. But in practice, Roman dairy was often more punishment than pleasure. Without refrigeration, pasteurization, or any solid understanding of bacteria, milk was a ticking time bomb, and yet people drank it. Or more often, they curdled it on purpose and called it cheese. Let's start with the basics. Cows were not the primary milk animals in ancient Rome. They were expensive, labour-intensive, and mostly reserved for ploughing or meat. Instead, Romans milked sheep and goats. Goat milk was especially popular in hilly regions, where the animals thrived on scrub and could survive without much care. The milk was sharp, grassy, and prone to spoiling if not consumed quickly. Sheep's milk was fattier and preferred for cheese making. Cow's milk, when available, was a luxury item, its rarity making it prized, though not necessarily better tasting. One mainstream historical fact: Romans didn't drink milk as a standalone beverage past childhood. Adults viewed milk with suspicion, especially fresh milk. It was considered unrefined, even barbaric. Northern tribes like the Gauls and Germans were mocked for guzzling the stuff, as if chugging warm goat milk was a sign of cultural inferiority. Civilized Romans, by contrast, consumed their dairy clothed in culture, literally turned into cheese, curd, or custard. And what cheeses they had: hard cheeses for soldiers, soft fresh ones for city folk, salty dry discs aged in caves, crumbly white mounds wrapped in fig leaves. Some cheeses were smoked over olive wood, others were soaked in brine or rubbed with herbs. Aged pecorino-style cheese was used like modern parmesan, grated over meals or nibbled with fruit and nuts. But for the poor, cheese wasn't always such a delight. Many households relied on lac concretum, milk left to curdle naturally, often in animal stomachs or clay pots. It produced a crumbly, tangy cheese that ranged from tolerable to terrifying. Depending on the temperature, humidity, and general luck, the result might be edible or might resemble a foot that had marinated in a sock. Roman cooks tried to mask sour notes with honey, vinegar, or herbs. Fresh curds were often served with olive oil and chopped garlic or paired with fruit. A common street food involved soft cheese wrapped in cabbage leaves and roasted over coals. It melted, it dripped, it occasionally crawled. But it was protein. And protein didn't ask questions. Now for a fringe curiosity, Roman veterinarians believed milk from a mangy sheep, yes, specifically one with mange, had medicinal properties. It was applied to skin rashes, supposedly driving out evil humours. It may not have worked, but it did ensure you never got too close to your healer. The dangers of spoiled milk weren't just theoretical. Diarrhea, cramps, and vomiting were all part of the dairy roulette. And still, milk found its way into many Roman kitchens. Rich families who could afford better storage and faster transport dabbled in custards and soft cheeses. Recipes survive for desserts made with boiled milk, honey, and wine-soaked raisins. But even these treats came with a sour whiff of risk. Let's imagine a market stall in the Subura district, where a woman scoops blobs of fresh cheese into palm-sized clay bowls. The air smells of garlic, warm sheep, and a hint of ammonia. A young boy buys a wedge, pokes it with a stick, and smiles. It's firm enough. His mother will mash it into a barley cake for lunch. If it's too sour, she'll drown it in vinegar. Problem solved. Roman soldiers often carried hard cheese wedges as part of their rations. Durable, salty, and dense, they offered long-term sustenance without requiring cooking. These cheeses could be shaved into soups or gnawed like jerky. Legionaries affectionately referred to them as armour crackers, both for their texture and their tendency to break teeth. There's also the mystery of Roman butter, or rather, the lack of it. While butter was known, it was not widely used. Considered rustic and greasy, it was associated with uncivilized peoples to the north. Roman texts mention butter as a skin salve, a laxative, and occasionally a medicine, but rarely as food. Cheese reigned supreme, with cream a rare indulgence. And yet, despite the risks, dairy occupied a respected place in Roman medicine. Doctors prescribed warm goat milk for coughs, sour milk for skin rashes, and even cheese poultices for joint pain. One popular treatment for stomach upset involved warm milk mixed with wine and coriander, a medieval smoothie with questionable consequences. Still, not all cheese was created equal. Cheap street cheese might contain contaminants from dirty hands, mouldy curds, or even bits of straw. And once spoiled, it turned hard and bitter fast. That didn't stop people from eating it. It just made them more inventive. Some grated it into vinegar soup, others fried it until crispy and dipped it in fig syrup. A few simply held their noses and hoped for the best. One open scholarly debate revolves around the true prevalence of fresh versus aged cheese. Some researchers argue that most Romans ate cheese young and soft, since aging required controlled conditions and time. Others point to cave-age specimens found in alpine regions and inscriptions listing long-distance cheese trades. The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle. Urban poor ate quick-curdled fresh cheeses, while wealthier Romans enjoyed imports and aged specialties. Let's visit a countryside dairy near Naples. The shepherd's wife pours milk into an earthen basin, adding rennet, often made from the stomach lining of calves or goats. She stirs slowly as curds form, then strains them through linen and presses them into small baskets. The wheels will dry in the sun, then be rubbed with olive oil and stored. A simple process, unchanged for generations. Back in Rome, a senator's kitchen boasts cheeses imported from as far away as Hispania. One variety is smoked, another marinated in wine. They're served on silver platters with dates and walnuts. The guests murmur approval. One boasts of a recent shipment of Alpine cheese, so sharp it burns the tongue in the best way. Of course, no one mentions that the slaves assembling these platters are chewing yesterday's sour curds behind the curtains. Here's a callback. Remember the gritty bread from earlier? Pair that with spoiled goat cheese and a splash of vinegar, and you have a classic pauper's lunch. Add a cabbage leaf and it's practically gourmet. Add a handful of ants? Probably accidental, but if they crunch quietly, no one minds. And then there's the aroma. Roman streets were filled with scents. Perfumed oil, incense, sewage. But dairy had its own footprint. Sour milk left in amphorae too long produced a distinct stench. A tenant might soak the amphora in vinegar to clean it, or just toss it into the alley and hope it smashed. Stray cats loved these jars. People did not, yet cheese endured. Across provinces, languages and class lines it remained a constant. Romans could do without spices, meat or wine, but not cheese. It was in the field rations, the market stalls, the religious offerings, even burned into votive meals for the gods. So next time you open the fridge and wrinkle your nose at a container of questionable yogurt, take a moment to salute your Roman ancestors. They sniffed, they sampled, and they often suffered. But they didn't give up on dairy. They just got better at masking the flavour. Because in ancient Rome, cheese wasn't just food, it was courage. The sun hangs high above the red rooftops of ancient Rome, baking the streets in a haze of heat and stench. Near the edge of a crowded alley, a merchant swats at flies buzzing over his cart. He sells barley cakes and cheap wine, but the real draw, though no one says it out loud, is the swarm of bugs hovering over the table, or more precisely, what's in the food, not just around it. You see, in ancient Rome, bugs weren't always unwanted visitors. Sometimes they were just part of the meal. Not deliberately, perhaps, not most of the time. But when food storage methods included clay jars, damp cellars and burlap sacks, creepy crawlies found their way in. And if you were poor, hungry and practical, a few extra legs weren't a deal-breaker. Let's start with the basics. Grain was the backbone of the Roman diet, especially for the lower classes, but stored grain attracted pests. Beetles, weevils, mealworms, tiny tenants that multiplied quickly and left their wriggling signatures in flour and meal. It was nearly impossible to keep them out. And for many, the effort simply wasn't worth it. You sifted when you could, you ignored when you couldn't, and you convinced yourself it was protein. One mainstream fact: archaeologists have found insect fragments embedded in carbonized loaves from Pompeii and Herculaneum. The evidence is clear. Bugs were being baked right into the bread. Whether on purpose or by accident, they became part of the Roman culinary experience. But there were also times when insects were eaten on purpose. Locusts, for example, were considered a viable food source during lean seasons. They were collected en masse, roasted or boiled, and seasoned with vinegar or garum. Crispy, salty, and high in protein, they filled bellies with surprisingly little effort. Even Pliny the Elder, the ever-curious cataloguer of Roman life, noted their consumption among certain rural communities. Let's visit one such village on the empire's edge. A boy runs through a field with a net made of reeds, chasing a cloud of buzzing locusts. His basket already holds a dozen or more. That night his mother will fry them in oil and sprinkle them with herbs. The meal might be unorthodox, but it's food. And unlike wheat, bugs don't require ploughing. Among the more elite classes, however, insects were less common on the menu, but not entirely absent. A few adventurous recipes included ant larvae, considered a delicacy in some regions. These were typically harvested from ant hills, boiled and served with honey. The texture was soft, the taste nutty. Some poets even refer to them as Roman caviar, though whether in jest or sincerity is anyone's guess. Now let's get fringe for a moment. Certain Roman physicians believed spider webs, collected and powdered, could be mixed into drinks to treat internal bleeding. Others claimed powdered cicada shells could act as a cure for epilepsy. Whether or not anyone actually swallowed these potions regularly is debatable, but the recipes existed, scrawled in the margins of scrolls, waiting for desperate hands. And then there were the accidental add-ons. Honey, prized for its sweetness and longevity, was rarely strained to perfection. Bees, wax, and the occasional larva were part of the package. You'd dip your bread, find a squish, and either spit or chew, depending on your mood. Some accepted it with a shrug, nature's extra. In Rome's bustling kitchens, bugs were a constant. Pantries without tight lids meant mealworms in your lentils, beetles in your flour, and moths in your dried fruit. And while the wealthy could afford sealed amphorae and regular inspections, the poor dealt with it daily. Shaking out the grain sack became a morning ritual. What didn't crawl away went into the pot. Let's zoom in on a public bakery near the Tiber. A slave shovels grain into a massive stone mill. He pauses to flick away a beetle but doesn't stop grinding. There's no time and no one cares. The flour smells faintly musty, but it will be baked before anyone notices, or at least before anyone complains. Satirists, of course, couldn't resist. Marshall once joked that a friend's bread was so filled with insects it needed a second crust just to hold the guests inside. Another writer claimed he bit into a fig and found more legs than seeds. The humour was dry, but the message was clear. Bugs were a fact of life. You laughed or you starved. Now, consider the psychology. In a society obsessed with hierarchy, bugs in your bread were also a class marker. The elite scoffed at insect-laced loaves, though they too ate them occasionally without realising. The poor, on the other hand, knew their food wasn't perfect. But they also knew bugs meant protein, energy, and sometimes even crunch. You chewed carefully and moved on. Here's a callback. Remember those barley gruels from earlier? They were perfect camouflage for bugs. Once boiled, everything blended into a grey mush. Was that a lentil? A beetle? A piece of chickpea husk? You'd never know, and that was probably for the best. One open scholarly debate centres on how Romans perceived these tiny co-diners. Were they seen as unfortunate intrusions or part of nature's gift? Some sources describe the ritual of inspecting flour by candlelight, sifting slowly for bugs. Others suggest complete indifference. The truth is likely mixed, just like their porridge. Now imagine a tenement family sharing dinner. A stew of beans, greens, and leftover bread simmers on the fire. The mother stirs, spots a worm and flicks it out. Another sinks unseen. The children eat heartily, never asking. Hunger makes for low expectations and fast forgiveness. Among the fringier food theorists, some argue that the accidental consumption of bugs may have helped build stronger immune systems, microbiomes toughened by exposure to wild proteins. It's speculative, sure, but considering the average Roman's diet, they needed every edge they could get. Bugs even showed up in medicine and ritual. Ground beetles mixed with vinegar were said to cure toothaches. Ants boiled in oil created a salve for joint pain. Some rituals involved placing dried locusts under pillows to ward off nightmares. Bugs weren't just food, they were folklore. And yet, for all the creativity, most Romans preferred their meals insect-free. When a fresh sack of grain arrived, when a clean fig was found, when a meal came without squirming, that was a good day. A victory. Proof that even in a bug-filled world you could still have standards. Let's close this scene in a quiet courtyard, where a baker sets down a warm loaf beside a cup of vinegar wine. He tears the bread, dips it, chews slowly. There's a slight crunch. He pauses, frowns, and keeps eating. Because in Rome, food was food, and bugs were just part of the texture. The sky over Rome darkens to a velvet bruise as the banquet hall fills with laughter, candlelight, and the muffled sighs of overeating. Reclining on cushions, draped in togas and smug self-satisfaction, Rome's elite reach for the wine jugs, their belts already loosened. The dishes have come and gone. Honey-glazed dormice, roast peacock, jellied eel, and now, for those who still have room, or think they do, dessert awaits. But wait, aren't they full? Isn't the human stomach finite? Enter the most persistent myth in Roman culinary lore, the vomitorium. Contrary to popular belief, the vomitorium wasn't a place where Romans purged mid-feast to make room for more flamingo tongue. It wasn't a bathroom, a marble-lined puke chamber, or a social trough of debauchery. In fact, a vomitorium was an architectural feature, a grand exit corridor in amphitheatres and stadiums designed to spew forth crowds efficiently. The term comes from vomere, meaning to discharge, and it referred to the audience, not the audience's lunch. So how did we end up imagining a world where emperors casually regurgitated oysters between courses? blame a tangle of mistranslations, overactive Victorian imaginations, and a real Roman tendency toward gastronomic excess. While there's no evidence of designated purge rooms, there is plenty of evidence that Roman feasting could get out of hand. Elite Roman banquets, convivia, were less about nourishment and more about performance. Hosts aimed to impress with rare foods, elaborate presentations, and courses that tested the limits of the digestive system. It was theatre with truffles and satire. The more exotic the dish, the more prestigious the host. Ostrich eggs, jellyfish, and sows' wombs all made appearances, often wrapped in gold leaf or surrounded by mechanical peacocks that fanned their tails mid-course. These events could last for hours, even days. Reclining on triclinia, dining couches, guests were encouraged to eat slowly, deliberately, and continually. Servers rotated through with hand towels, perfumed oil, and fresh wine. And yes, some guests excused themselves mid-feast, not to a vomitorium, but perhaps to a quiet corner, to discreetly relieve pressure and return refreshed. This wasn't ritual, it wasn't architectural, it was, well, human. Mainstream historians generally agree that Romans prized appetite as a symbol of abundance. To eat heartily was to signal status, virility, and divine favour. Emperors like Vitellius were infamous for their gluttony. Suetonius tells us he once consumed a dish of pike liver, pheasant brains, flamingo tongues, and lamprey eggs, all in one sitting. Did he keep it down? Unclear, but that's not the point. The point is, he could afford to try. So, did Romans vomit during meals? Almost certainly. But did they build special rooms for it? Almost certainly not. More likely they excused themselves briefly, using cloths or chamber pots or simply stepping outside. The wealthy had slaves to clean up afterward. The poor just didn't have this problem, they couldn't afford to overeat in the first place. Let's shift now to a more modest gathering. A merchant's family hosts a birthday feast. There's roasted goat, figs, bread soaked in oil, and cheap wine flowing freely. The guests eat with gusto, laughing through full mouths. After a while, someone leans back, groans theatrically, and pats his belly. No one rushes to vomit. They unbuckle their belts, lie flatter on their couches, and let the wine dull the ache. Among Rome's less refined citizens, vomiting for room was considered vulgar, even animalistic. Philosophers like Seneca scorned the practice, describing it as the sign of a man who worships his mouth more than the gods, and yet he acknowledges its frequency, particularly among the idle rich. Hypocrisy was always part of the seasoning in Rome. Let's talk about emetics. Yes, they existed. Roman physicians prescribed mixtures of salt water, ipecac-like roots, and herbal teas to induce vomiting. Not for gluttony, but to rebalance the humours. If you'd overeaten, caught a stomach bug, or simply wanted to start fresh, a purge might be recommended. But this was medical, not recreational. That said, some wealthier Romans began to blur the lines, using emetics to clear the way for more indulgence. Imagine it. A vomit to cleanse the palate. Charming. Now, for a particularly fringe notion, some temples had oracular priests who fasted for days, then consumed massive quantities of food in ritualistic feasts, followed by forced purges. The idea was to symbolically absorb, then release, divine chaos. There's scant evidence, but the myth persists, probably because it fits so well with our image of Roman excess. Whether or not it happened, people believed it could have, and that's almost as telling. Satirists, as always, had a field day. The poet Juvenal described a man who had slaves hold him upside down to shake food from his stomach, like a wineskin. Martial joked about party guests who disappeared behind the curtains, returned pink-cheeked and hollow-bellied. The lines between fact and mockery were blurred, but the message was clear. Excess was absurd, and everyone knew it. Let's pause in a candlelit atrium, where a young noble tries to keep up with the older guests. He's overstuffed, overwhelmed, and tipsy. He slips away quietly, stepping into a cool corridor. There's no vomitorium, just a bench, some herbs, and a patient slave with a towel. He leans over, retches softly, wipes his mouth, and returns to the couch with a smile. Dessert is being served. Dessert, incidentally, was often just as intense as the courses before. Honey cakes, dried fruits stuffed with nuts, wine-soaked pastries, and cheeses drenched in mulsum, spiced wine syrup. If your stomach was already groaning, these sweets could tip the scales. Hence the need, perhaps, for that not-so-mythical pause. Here's a modern comparison. Imagine Thanksgiving, but with 20 more courses, no chairs, no elastic waistbands, and the ever-present threat of someone releasing a trained flamingo. That's a Roman banquet. It wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed for awe, yet not all Romans embraced this lifestyle. The Stoics, the Cynics, the Moralists, they all warned against gluttony. To them, a man was most powerful when he could eat plainly and walk away satisfied. "Control your appetite," said Epictetus, "or it will control you." Unfortunately, such advice rarely landed well in a room full of roast ostrich and laughter. Let's walk past a crumbling tenement now. Inside, a family eats a quiet meal. Barley gruel, pickled onions, and a shared fig. No belt loosening, no slaves, just gratitude and a warm fire. They've heard tales of elite feasts, of vomiting and indulgence, and they roll their eyes. "Must be nice," the father mutters. His son grins. "Someday I'll eat until I burst." His mother smacks his head gently and hands him another crust. One open, scholarly debate centres around whether the Romans viewed these feasts as moral decline or divine right. Some inscriptions praise banquets as gifts from the gods, proof of abundance and imperial favour. Others frame them as signs of corruption, warnings of decadence and doom. Did the average Roman see overindulgence as shameful or aspirational? The answer probably depended on whether you were holding a silver fork or begging for crusts outside the gate. So, to sum it all up like a good after-dinner digestive, the vomitorium wasn't real. But the reasons we believed in it absolutely were. The Romans did feast to excess. They did vomit. They did build palaces around their appetites. And we, centuries later, mistook their architectural exits for exits of another kind. It's a misunderstanding rooted in awe. How could they eat that much, that often, with that much flair? Surely, we reasoned, they must have invented a system. But the truth is simpler, messier, and more human. They didn't build rooms for it. They just found a quiet corner, leaned over, and hoped no one was watching. And maybe, in a way, that's even more Roman. The sun dips behind the Palatine Hill, casting long shadows over the opulent mansions of Rome's wealthier citizens. Inside one such villa, a feast is already well underway. Marble floors shimmer beneath oil lamps, peacocks strut in the courtyard, and a servant carefully balances a silver tray piled with tongues, flamingo tongues to be exact, glistening, rosy, and absurdly expensive. Welcome to the strange, luxurious, and sometimes stomach-turning world of upper-class Roman feasting, where nothing was off-limits, and revolting was often the point. It's tempting to think that only the poor had to suffer through questionable meals, but the truth is more complicated. The rich had options, yes, but those options often veered into bizarre and excessive territory. If the poor scraped by on stale bread and insect-flecked gruel, the rich stuffed themselves with imported sea creatures, offbeat organs, and elaborately disguised leftovers. It wasn't about taste, it was about spectacle. Let's start with flamingo tongues. Why tongues, you ask? Because they were rare, because they were difficult to harvest, because they symbolised dominion over nature. Also, according to some, because they had a delicate texture and absorbed flavours well. More likely, though, they were a culinary flex. A typical elite feast might involve a dozen flamingos, each slain and served not for their meat, but for the tiny fork-sized prize within their beaks. And this was just the beginning. Apicius, the famed Roman gastronome whose name became shorthand for extra, recommended dishes like sow's wombs poached in wine, jellyfish with eggs, and parrots stewed in fig syrup. His cookbook, De Re Coquinaria, reads like a fever dream of indulgence. Recipes include ingredients like garum, lovage, and myrtle berries, but always with a twist. Why use beef when you can use ostrich? Why serve fish whole when you can gelatinize it? Of course, these extravagances didn't go unnoticed. Philosophers like Seneca scorned them. "You say you are feeding guests," he once wrote, "but you are feeding your vanity." Yet that didn't stop hosts from pushing the envelope. After all, a feast wasn't just dinner. It was a performance, a political manoeuvre, a social ladder rung. You impressed not by filling your guests' bellies, but by astonishing them into silence. Eel pudding, for instance, was a showstopper. Not so much a pudding in the modern sense, it was more like a moulded gelatin packed with poached eel, herbs and wine sauce. Served cold, it shimmered under candlelight and often came moulded in grotesque shapes. Skulls, hands, or even miniature amphorae. Eating it was as much a dare as a delight. Let's set the scene. A patrician reclines on a cushioned bench as a platter is revealed before him. A glazed piglet stuffed with live thrushes. When carved, the birds burst forth in a flurry of wings, a living surprise hidden inside dinner. Laughter erupts. The piglet is carved further to reveal a sausage coil of honey-roasted dormice and peppered raisins. The guests applaud, whether they're amused or simply terrified of offending the host. Now here's the kicker. Much of this extravagant food wasn't even eaten. The rich often tasted and moved on. Plates were piled high and discarded half full. Slaves cleared uneaten delicacies, sometimes eating them themselves, if the meat hadn't spoiled. Other times they were thrown out, fed to animals, or simply left to rot. The waste was staggering, especially compared to the rations of Rome's poor, who might go weeks without a decent meal. But sometimes scraps made their way back into the hands of the needy. Leftovers from elite villas were gathered by servants or clients and passed down. A well-connected freedman might secure the bones from a senator's roast goose, or the trimmings from a gilded sturgeon. These bits, though stale or slightly off, were feasts compared to standard fare. Let's follow one such client, a man named Lucius, who receives a bag of gift food from his patron's kitchen. Inside, a half-eaten fig tart, 3 slices of honey-glazed peacock, a handful of over-salted olives, and a pigeon wing still attached to some very pink meat. Lucius brings it home like treasure. His wife will reheat it over the brazier, serve it with cabbage, and stretch it into 2 meals. If the peacock's turned, well, extra vinegar? Here's a mainstream fact. Roman food distribution was deeply tied to politics. Emperors like Augustus and Trajan used state-funded feasts and grain doles to curry favour with the people. Massive banquets, epula publica, were held in forums and arenas where the populace was fed roasted oxen, flatbread and wine. But the food at these gatherings was more humble, more digestible, and decidedly less flamingo-ish. It was the food of unity, not spectacle. Back in private feasts, the ingredients got even stranger. Peacock brains, camel heels, boar udders. Dishes weren't just rare, they were anatomically specific. The goal wasn't always taste. Sometimes it was novelty, or perceived medical benefit. Some believed eating lion liver increased courage. Others swore that dolphin meat enhanced memory. It probably didn't. But who was going to argue with a man who just served you sea hedgehog pâté among the stranger fringe delicacies? The livers of fattened geese fed with figs and wine, a cruel precursor to modern foie gras. The process involved force-feeding the birds until their livers swelled unnaturally. The resulting organ was considered creamy, rich, and highly sought after. Even the gods supposedly appreciated such delicacies. Temple offerings often included rare cuts of meat, or fish stuffed with dates and pine nuts. But for every decadent dish, there was a counterpoint of discomfort. Some guests at these banquets grew sick, either from overeating, poor storage, or unfamiliar ingredients. Food poisoning was not uncommon, especially with exotic seafood shipped in from distant provinces. And yet, feasting continued. Because stopping would mean admitting you were full, and in Rome's elite circles, appetite was power. Open scholarly debate still simmers over how often the average Roman experienced these excesses. While literature paints vivid images, many historians believe only a small fraction of society regularly indulged in jellyfish aspic or whole lark skewers. For most citizens, even the lower elite, a roast chicken with olives was a celebration. Let's pause at a small domus in the Aventine district, where a wealthy merchant hosts a feast, not imperial, but comfortable. His guests recline on woven mats. The table holds grilled fish, chickpea salad, stuffed figs, and warm honeyed wine. There's laughter, gentle conversation, and not a flamingo in sight. This too was Rome. Not every rich man needed a parade of eel gelatin, and yet, the extremes defined the cultural memory. Roman decadence became shorthand for decline, a feast at the edge of collapse. Later historians, Christian chroniclers in particular, pointed to these meals as symbols of moral decay. They dined on sin, one wrote, and found their plates empty when the barbarians came. But back then, in the candlelight, surrounded by friends, honey-drizzled bread, and live musical accompaniment, it didn't feel like decay. It felt like triumph. It felt like Rome. So the next time you flinch at a fusion restaurant menu or wonder why someone would eat sea urchin foam, remember, the Romans did it first. And probably weirder, the moon casts a pale light over the rooftops of ancient Rome as quiet prayers drift skyward from the threshold of a modest home. Inside, a family kneels before a small altar, heads bowed, hands clasped. The scent of incense hangs heavy in the air. Today is a fast day, and dinner, if you can call it that, is nothing more than a thin broth, a heel of bread, and a pot of salted fish left to stew since morning. It smells faintly of the sea, and of things that maybe should have stayed there. For many Romans, religion wasn't a weekly affair. It was a daily rhythm, woven into meals, chores, even bath times, and that rhythm came with restrictions. Days of feasting were punctuated by days of fasting, sacred festivals, funerals, rites of purification, all demanded adjustments to the menu. And in those moments, when sacrifice trumped satisfaction, cuisine turned from indulgence to endurance. Salted fish, often rotten, always pungent, became the backbone of religious fasting fare. Not because it was holy, but because it was not meat. Fish, being cold-blooded and aquatic, didn't count as flesh in the same sense. Religious rituals tied to purification, mourning or observance often prohibited red meat, poultry, or anything deemed hot-blooded. The result? A cuisine of compromise. Take salsamenta, a general Roman term for salted fish products. These range from dried anchovies to pickled mackerel to fish paste so aged and aromatic it could summon flies from 3 alleys over. These items, while technically edible, were often borderline foul. Some had been dried in the sun for months, others soaked in vats of vinegar and herbs until their bones softened into a chalky mush. A favoured preparation was to mash fish with leeks and garum, boil the mixture and smear it over stale bread. Yes, that's the real recipe. Mainstream historians agree that fish became the fasting day MVP, not just for its religious convenience, but because it was relatively cheap and preserved well. However, that preservation came at a price, mostly paid by the noses of everyone within 50 feet. Let's drop in on a humble Roman kitchen. A widow prepares her evening meal, a single sardine, split and stretched over 2 slices of barley bread. The smell so strong it doubles as mosquito repellent. She sprinkles on chopped herbs to mask the odour, then sets the food on the household shrine as an offering before taking a single cautious bite. The wealthy, of course, didn't suffer quite the same way. Their fast-day meals might include imported smoked eel, shellfish, or marinated octopus, accompanied by exotic fruits and spiced wine. But even they had to follow the rules. No meat, no feasting, no garish display, at least not officially. Some hosted quiet, private banquets that definitely weren't parties. Just a few friends, just a few courses, just a flamingo in fish sauce. Totally normal. Yet even in fasting, culinary creativity found a foothold. Recipes emerged for lentil stews mimicking meat texture, barley cakes shaped like poultry legs, and dried figs soaked in vinegar to give the illusion of savouriness. Deprivation inspired innovation. And yes, sometimes deception. A clever housewife might add a bit of dried blood sausage to a bean stew for flavour, then swear it was purely accidental if the temple priest dropped by. Now, let's get quirky. A few fringe religious sects believed that not eating fish on fast days was actually more pious. They saw all animal life as sacred and subsisted on boiled grains, honey water, and nuts. These groups were rare, mocked by mainstream Romans, and occasionally accused of sorcery when they looked too healthy during a famine. But they existed, and their recipes, minimal as they were, show up in a few dusty scrolls preserved by early Christian communities. Christianity. The new faith would eventually inherit and expand on Rome's fasting traditions. Early Christians adapted Roman fasts into Lenten practices, continuing the love-hate relationship with salted fish. Paintings from late antiquity show baskets of sardines, loaves of barley bread and bowls of olives. The aesthetic of simplicity, eating not to delight, but to endure. Let's turn our gaze to a Roman temple precinct during the festival of Vesta. Fires burn in sacred hearths, and worshippers, dressed in white, lay down offerings. No one eats meat today. Instead, they share boiled eggs, honey cakes, and dried figs. A priestess offers a prayer, then hands out thin slices of smoked mullet, its salty skin glistening in the firelight. Everyone chews in silence. It is not delicious, but it is right. Of course, not every religious fast was well observed. Satirists poked fun at hypocrites who proclaimed their piety while sneaking lamb kebabs under their cloaks. One joke involves a priest scolding a boy for eating sausages during a funeral, only to be caught later sneaking ham into his own stew pot. "Do as I say," the boy quips, "and pass the garum." Here's a scholarly debate to chew on. Did Romans genuinely believe in the spiritual merit of fasting, or was it more about social signalling and tradition? Some argue that fasting brought focus, clarity, and humility, aligning the soul with the gods. Others suggest it was just another performance, another stage upon which Romans strutted their virtues. Either way, the food told the story: sparse, humble, earthy, and usually just slightly spoiled. Among the poorer classes, religious fasts sometimes went unnoticed, not out of disrespect, but because every day was a fast day. If your pantry held only beans and barley, skipping meat wasn't an act of sacrifice, it was just life. And so, ironically, the elite had to manufacture their fasting while the poor lived it unprompted. Let's visit a cramped tenement. A mother prepares a thin lentil mash for her children. She lights a stick of incense at the hearth, whispers a short prayer, and divides the meal equally. Her neighbour, slightly better off, offers a few olives in trade. Together they share the food. There's no meat, no sugar, no oil. But there is warmth, and ritual, and silence. On the other side of town, a senator reclines with a modest meal prepared by slaves, pickled onions, figs, and salted fish presented with care. He sighs theatrically. "I long for roast boar," he says. His steward bows. "Tomorrow, Dominus?" Oh, for now he suffers through his ascetic supper, plotting tomorrow's feast even as he chews. And so it went. Cycles of plenty and paucity, devotion and deception, rot and reverence. The Roman calendar demanded both indulgence and restraint, and both found their expression in food. Fish, especially the preserved kind, became the anchor of abstinence. Over time, the taste of salt and vinegar, the tang of fermented fish, came to symbolize something deeper: submission to ritual, respect for tradition, and the quiet, growling dignity of a belly that waited. So the next time you pass on a meal, whether for health, belief, or timing, think of the Romans, of the salted sardines left out in the sun, of the barley cakes flavoured with sacrifice, of the prayers whispered over bitter stew. They knew hunger, and sometimes they embraced it, even if the fish smelled like it was judging them. A cool wind rolls down from the Esquiline hill as nightfall wraps its cloak around the city of Rome. Down in the marketplace, torches flicker in doorways, casting long shadows over shuttered stalls and silent fountains. But one corner is alive with movement. A line of grim-faced citizens snakes through the forum, clutching baskets, jugs, or just empty hands. At the head of the line, a distribution table, a man with a scroll, a tally stick, and a barrel of grain. It's breadline time, and the tension is thick enough to spread on toast, if anyone had any. Food shortages in ancient Rome weren't occasional hiccups. They were recurring storms that tested the city's infrastructure and the patience of its people. Though Rome boasted a vast network of trade routes, farms, and granaries, it also boasted over 1 million hungry mouths. And when even a single link in the supply chain faltered, chaos wasn't far behind. The Roman grain dole, annona, was designed to feed the masses. Citizens received monthly rations of grain, measured out by weight, registered by name. At its peak, the program distributed enough wheat to feed over 200,000 people. It was a marvel of logistics and a pillar of imperial propaganda. But when ships were delayed by storms, blockades, or pirates, that marvel quickly buckled. Mainstream historians agree. Food distribution was Rome's political lifeline. Emperors who maintained the grain supply were adored. Those who didn't risked revolt. Nero, for all his faults, understood this. After the Great Fire, he opened his private granaries and lowered prices. Caligula, on the other hand, once delayed shipments to make a point, and nearly lost his head to the ensuing outrage. Let's zoom in on a chaotic morning at the Porticus Minutia Frumentaria, the designated grain distribution centre. Hundreds of citizens press forward, their faces tight with worry. Rumours swirl. The African shipment was late. The Tiber is flooded. The weights are being manipulated. A woman shouts that her name was erased from the list. A man swears the flour smells like rat urine. A guard raises his voice, then his club. The line moves, barely. But for those denied grain, the options are bleak. You beg, you steal, or you barter with someone who got luckier. A man with extra barley might trade for a daughter's necklace. Another might sell his own sandals for a sack of spelt. In the back alleys, the black market thrives, as it always does when regulation stumbles. Let's shift to the Aventine, where a baker receives half his usual flour. His shelves sit half empty. He eyes the old stock in the corner, musty, maybe a little mouldy. He shrugs. By morning it'll be bread. No one will ask questions. And now, the darker truth. When grain ran out entirely, when rations stopped arriving and bread prices soared, Rome turned dangerous. Crowds grew restless. Fires broke out. Mobs overturned carts. One famous riot during the reign of Claudius nearly escalated into civil war, all over the price of wheat. His solution? Publicly blame corrupt officials, execute a few scapegoats, and distribute emergency grain from Sicily. Order was restored. Barely. But it wasn't just grain. Meat, vegetables, even wine could vanish from markets during shortages. And when desperation mounted, people turned to strange measures. Horse meat, once taboo, became a famine staple. Crows, dogs, and rats were caught and skinned in secret. The poor boiled shoe leather or stewed weeds gathered from roadside ditches. One especially grim fringe case involves body brokers, men who dealt in the sale of corpses, mostly for religious rites or medicine, but occasionally for something more sinister. In times of famine, whispered rumours swirled that a corpse gone unclaimed might be repurposed. There's no concrete proof of cannibalism in Rome during food shortages, but the fear was real enough to inspire laws against grave robbing and the desecration of corpses. Let's follow a desperate man named Septimus, a dock worker turned thief. His wife and children haven't eaten in 2 days. The bakery denied him credit. The grain line closed early. Tonight he prowls the market's edge looking for scraps. He steals a bruised apple from a shrine, a loaf from a window. He's caught, beaten and thrown into a holding cell. Tomorrow he'll be fined or flogged. His family will still be hungry. Now compare that to a wealthy villa on the Caelian Hill. The matron frets over the quality of her wheat import. It's dusty, she says, not like the stuff from Egypt. Her steward apologises, promises better by next week. She sighs and orders the servants to make couscous instead. In the city below, her neighbours fight over stale barley. Here's a scholarly debate worth stirring. Were these food shortages natural consequences of scale or symptoms of deeper rot, bureaucracy, corruption, and systemic imbalance? Some scholars point to droughts and pirates, others point to hoarding, mismanagement, and elite indifference. The answer, as usual, is both. In the countryside, the shortages often hit later but harder. Farmers still had grain, but no buyers. Roads were unsafe. Taxes increased. Soldiers demanded tribute. So while Rome starved, granaries rotted in Gaul, Sicily, and Africa. Local revolts flared, and always someone profited. Back in the city, religious leaders held emergency rituals. They begged the gods, Ceres, Tellus, even obscure agricultural spirits, for rain, for wind, for safe harbours. Processions of fasting citizens wound through the streets, chanting, praying, offering mouldy loaves at shrines. Did it work? Who knows? But belief filled the belly, if only for a moment. Meanwhile, the empire grew. More mouths, more pressure. Emperors responded with bigger ships, more bureaucracy, and promises of eternal plenty. Grain fleets became naval priorities. Ports were expanded, but the cracks remained. And when they widened, riots erupted, not just over food, but over dignity. Hunger reveals what civility conceals. One quirky detail. Sometimes the emperor would host public feasts to quell unrest. Whole oxen roasted in forums, bread tossed from balconies. It was theatre, and it worked, for a day. Then the hunger returned, and with it the tension. Let's return now to the breadline. The man with the scroll calls the final name. A woman steps forward. She receives her ration, half what she expected. She says nothing, just nods, clutches her sack, and disappears into the crowd. This, too, was Rome. Not the marble and gold, not the banquets, but the waiting, the hoping, the trading of trinkets for crumbs, the simmering fear beneath the surface of the world's most powerful city. So next time you grumble over a late delivery or an empty store shelf, remember the Romans, who stood in the shadows of temples waiting for grain that may never arrive, clutching their tokens and muttering prayers not to gods, but to bureaucracy. Because in Rome, food was never just food, it was politics, it was power, and when it vanished, so did the illusion of peace. A dry wind sweeps over the worn stones of the Appian Way, where Roman sandals crunch across dust and gravel, and the summer sun turns every stone into a skillet. The city is quiet, eerily so. The market stalls are closed. The fountains have slowed to a trickle, and inside the tenements and temples a grim hush has settled. It's famine season, and in its grip, even the unthinkable becomes part of the menu. When food supplies failed completely, when grain convoys never arrived, and bread lines ended with empty baskets, Romans turned to desperation dishes. Meals made not of food, but of what could simply be swallowed. Bark, grass, bricks ground into powder. It was survival in the rawest form. You ate what your stomach would tolerate, and you prayed it wouldn't kill you. Let's start with tree bark. It wasn't a delicacy, not even close. But the inner layers, specifically the cambium between the wood and the outer bark, could be scraped, dried, and ground into a fibrous powder. This was then mixed with water and sometimes a pinch of ash to make a flat, bitter cake. Chewing it was like gnawing old rope soaked in vinegar, but it gave the illusion of fullness, and when your children were crying, even that was enough. Mainstream historical accounts from times of extreme scarcity mention bark-based gruel and famine bread made with up to 60% non-food filler. Bark, sawdust, or pulverised husks. In some regions, a particular variety of elm was prized not for its shade, but for its chewability. Farmers stripped it bare during bad harvests, and the trees died quietly as their branches fed the people. Then came bricks, not whole of course, but powder scraped from sun-dried mud or crumbled from unused walls. Clay was believed to have some absorbent cleansing qualities. Some Roman doctors even prescribed small amounts for indigestion, but desperate citizens took this farther, mixing clay dust into their flour to stretch it. The resulting bread was dry, bitter, and often dangerously sharp. It wore down teeth, aggravated stomach ulcers, and in some cases poisoned the very people it was meant to sustain. Let's peer into a tenement kitchen, where a woman kneels beside her hearth, pounding old mortar into dust. She stirs it into a slurry with a handful of barley. Her husband looks on, silent. He knows what it is, but he won't stop her. Tonight, it will pass for soup. Tomorrow, who knows? Other desperate ingredients found their way onto the table. Chalk scraped from walls, straw ground into powder, boiled leather sandals simmered until soft and seasoned with garlic, parchment boiled down to a thin, gelatinous broth. There are scattered mentions in Roman literature of people eating scrolls during famine, not metaphorically, but literally. The ink was bitter, the parchment chewy, but it filled the void. In the countryside, survival meals took different forms. Wild roots that were usually toxic were boiled repeatedly to leach out the poisons. Acorns were ground and soaked for days, then baked into flat, dense discs. Even insects, usually avoided, were harvested and roasted. Ants, earthworms, beetles. Not delicacies, but calories. And calories were king. One fringe remedy involved boiling crushed rocks in vinegar and straining the liquid, which was thought to carry trace minerals. It tasted metallic, but supposedly eased hunger pangs. Whether it actually worked or was just the placebo effect of warm liquid, no one can say. But the recipe appears in at least 2 medical manuscripts from late antiquity. Let's walk now through a makeshift soup kitchen, really just a courtyard where volunteers ladle a watery broth into cracked bowls. It contains cabbage stems, onion skins, and bits of bark. Children clutch their bowls with both hands, sipping slowly, savouring every gritty, tepid mouthful. For some, this will be their only meal today. The psychological toll of these meals was enormous. Hunger weakens the body, yes, but also the mind. People grew paranoid, irritable, even delirious. Fights broke out over spoiled figs. Thefts increased. Some turned to the temples, begging the gods for aid. Others cursed the heavens and whispered that maybe the gods had left. But food, real food, was still out there. In elite homes, in military storehouses, in sealed granaries. The problem wasn't always production. It was access. A senator with 20 sacks of wheat might choose to hoard them, waiting for prices to rise. A corrupt official might sell half the grain shipment to black market dealers, and a well-fed garrison might guard its stores more tightly than the city gates. Here's a bleak truth. Starvation in Rome wasn't just a natural disaster. It was often a man-made one. This fed resentment. Riots weren't just expressions of hunger. They were expressions of fury, that the system had failed, that the promises were lies, that Rome, the eternal city, cared more about pageantry than people. Sometimes, citizens struck back in creative ways. A satirist wrote of a crowd storming a corrupt merchant's warehouse, only to find it filled not with grain, but with imported perfumes. They burned it anyway, and the scent drifted over the city, a funeral incense for their hopes. Let's pause at a funeral procession now. A child, thin as a shadow, carried in a wooden box. No priest, no pomp, just silence. His family had eaten nothing but boiled weeds for weeks. He didn't make it. They bury him with a crust of bread, an offering for the afterlife, or perhaps just the wish that he be full there. And still, the city moved on. Senators debated, poets wrote, and soldiers drilled. Hunger didn't stop the empire, but it cracked it, chipped away at its marble illusions. It reminded Rome that greatness without grain was just a hollow promise. Even the language bore scars. The word for famine, fames, became a ghost, a spectre invoked in poetry and prayer. Fames stalks the street, they would say. Fames devours the young. It wasn't just hunger, it was personified despair. One open scholarly debate surrounds the actual caloric intake of Romans during famine periods. Some argue that average citizens subsisted on as little as 500 calories a day for weeks, mostly from diluted porridge and boiled greens. Others believe many simply starved in silence, their deaths unrecorded, their stories lost. But the archaeology tells us something. In the bones, in the teeth, signs of malnutrition, stunted growth, deficiencies, patterns that align with known famine years. The record is there, written not in ink, but in marrow. Now step back, high above the rooftops of Rome. The city gleams under moonlight. Statues cast long shadows, temples stand tall. And yet, beneath that beauty, in its kitchens and alleys, people are boiling bark. Because survival in Rome was not always glorious. It was not always poetic. Sometimes it was desperate. Sometimes it was dust in your mouth. And sometimes it was chewing a piece of wall and pretending it was bread. So the next time your pantry feels empty, when you grumble about skipping lunch or eating the same thing twice, think of Rome, of children gnawing leather, of mothers grinding clay, of a city that feasted and starved in the same breath, and of the terrible resilience it took to keep chewing, even when there was nothing left worth tasting. The sky dawns heavy and grey over the backyards of Roman villas and the cramped quarters of tenements. Down below the surface, where sunlight is a luxury, thousands of enslaved men, women and children stir awake, or are stirred by handlers with sticks and shouted commands. Another day begins, and with it, another round of labour for Rome's vast engine of servitude. But today, we follow not their toil, but their meals, the strange, sparse and sometimes surprisingly inventive ways that slaves kept themselves alive. In the grand picture of Roman life, enslaved people were essential. They ploughed fields, built aqueducts, tutored children, prepared meals, and kept the machinery of empire humming. Yet their own sustenance was often an afterthought. Unlike citizens, who even at the lowest rung had some right to grain distributions, slaves received food based on the whims and wallets of their masters. At best, a household slave might be fed from the kitchen's leftovers, scraps of meat, crusts of bread, half-eaten fruit. In many wealthy homes, this created a kind of trickle-down cuisine. Roast goose for the master meant goose bones for the servant. Baked custard became scorched pudding scraped from the bottom of the dish. And while that sounds bleak, it often beat the alternative: rations. For slaves working on farms, in mines or factories, meals were standardised, monotonous, and calculated for efficiency over pleasure. A typical daily ration might include a small measure of grain, usually barley or spelt, a handful of dried legumes, and perhaps a few ounces of vinegar or wine. Vegetables were occasional, meat rare, salt if you were lucky. And yet these ingredients were stretched, combined, and reimagined into something that at least resembled food. Let's begin with the porridge. Pulse, that infamous Roman grain mush, was the backbone of slave diets. Boiled until soft, or at least until the bugs stopped moving, it was served plain or with wild greens when available. Some added vinegar for sharpness. Others, if they had access to a fire, might fry leftover pulse into cakes. Crispy edges, chewy centres. It wasn't gourmet, but it was different. One mainstream fact: archaeological digs at slave quarters across the empire have revealed cooking pits and makeshift stoves where communal meals were prepared. Even with scraps, people cooked. They experimented. They seasoned with weeds, leftover brine, or ashes from burnt meat. In some places, the remains of communal stew show evidence of creative substitutions: fish bones for broth, olive pits for added oil, even pulverized snail shells for texture. Slaves assigned to elite kitchens fared slightly better. Though forbidden from tasting the food meant for their masters, they inevitably absorbed knowledge, techniques, flavours. When they cooked for themselves, late at night, in hidden corners, they recreated simplified versions of what they'd served. A barley and garlic paste rolled in grape leaves, onions roasted over embers, then mashed with goat's milk, bread made from borrowed flour and stretched with bean husk. There's even a fringe historical theory that some of Rome's best street food, cheap, hearty, flavourful, was first developed by slaves and freedmen who brought their knowledge from wealthy households to the marketplace. The humble meatball, for example, may have been born in the back rooms of a senator's kitchen before becoming a staple of every corner cart. Let's pause at one such cart in the Subura district. A freedman stirs a pot of stew over a low flame. Chickpeas, onion, wine, vinegar, and something meaty, though you don't ask what. Nearby, a woman sells flatbread smeared with mashed lentils and fish sauce. She's a former kitchen slave, now independent. Her food is cheap, nourishing, and slightly addictive. Soldiers line up, students, even the occasional senator's son slumming it for a thrill. Meanwhile, in the countryside, survival cooking takes a more rustic turn. A slave harvesting olives sneaks a few bruised ones into his tunic. At night, he roasts them over coals, then crushes them with garlic and barley into a paste. His friend, a herder, brings goat cheese whey, the runoff from cheese pressing. They mix it, and suddenly it's a spread. Salty, tangy, bitter, but undeniably food. Sometimes kindness-shaped meals. A lenient master might allow garden plots, where slaves grew onions, turnips, or herbs. These gardens, tiny and fiercely defended, became culinary lifelines. A sprig of rosemary in a bland pot of gruel could mean the difference between nourishment and nausea. One open scholarly debate centres on the role of slave markets in shaping cuisine. Did the constant influx of enslaved people from across the empire, Gaul, Syria, Africa, introduce new ingredients and techniques? Some argue that Rome's culinary diversity came not from trade, but from slavery. A Syrian cook might introduce spiced lamb stew, a Gallic shepherd, a fermented cheese technique. These recipes filtered upward, slowly influencing even elite kitchens. Yet despite these moments of creativity, the reality remained harsh. Many slaves ate poorly and rarely. Illness, overwork, and exposure made even basic digestion a challenge. A thin soup might be all a person could stomach after 12 hours in the fields or under the lash. Let's zoom in on a mining slave in Hispania. He's allowed one meal a day, a ball of barley dough, a few olives, and a tin cup of sour wine. He eats it in darkness, surrounded by rock and dust. There's no flavour, no variety, just fuel. His body breaks down faster than the tools he uses. Still, he eats, and when the olives run out, he sucks the pits for salt. Satirists rarely wrote about slave food, but graffiti tells part of the story. In Pompeii, a scrawl reads, "Better old fish than none." Another says, "My master eats with a golden fork. I eat bones. It's humour, but grim." And yet, there were stories of resilience. Slaves who pooled ingredients for feast days, who hid figs for weeks to share during Saturnalia, who sang songs while cooking, turning a pot of boiled weeds into something communal. Food became a language, a way of reclaiming dignity, however briefly. Here's a curious fringe tidbit. Some slave cooks were so talented that they gained fame. Wealthy patrons would brag about their chef's abilities. A good cook could elevate an entire household status. Occasionally, these cooks were freed and went on to open taverns or even write cookbooks, though their names are often lost to time. But most never escaped the kitchens. Their meals, their tricks, their substitutions, all passed along orally, in whispers and stirrings and seasoning pinches. The legacy of their survival lies not in statues or scrolls, but in flavour profiles that lingered, morphed, and eventually became part of Italian cuisine itself. So imagine one last kitchen, a windowless room, a single fire pit. 3 slaves huddled around a pot of lentils, garlic, and something that might be rat or rabbit. They eat quietly, tired, but together. And for a few minutes, the empire outside vanishes. Because even in chains, even in hunger, people still cooked, still shared, still seasoned what little they had. And in doing so, they turned survival into resistance, bite by bite. A low thunder rumbles over the 7 hills of Rome, not from the sky, but from the city itself. It's the sound of unrest, of thousands of stomachs gnawing at themselves, of desperation stretching tight across a starving metropolis. The aqueducts still flow, the statues still gleam, but something has fractured beneath the surface. Rome is under siege, sometimes by enemies, sometimes by weather, and sometimes by its own incompetence. And when the gates close and the supplies dwindle, people begin to eat the unimaginable. Sieges in ancient Rome weren't frequent, but when they happened, they were brutal. The city's immense walls and strategic layout made it a hard target for outside forces, but Rome had no shortage of internal conflicts. During civil wars, rebellious generals, and barbarian incursions, parts of the city could be cut off from food sources for weeks, sometimes months. And as panic replaced routine, the Roman diet took a dark and historic turn. The earliest reports of siege-related starvation date back to the early Republic, when neighbouring tribes attempted to blockade the city. Later, under emperors like Aurelian or during the Gothic Wars, entire neighbourhoods found themselves encircled, isolated, and left to fend for themselves. Granaries were looted, breadlines collapsed, markets vanished. Hunger began its slow, humiliating march. At first, people stretched what little they had: wheat husks, lentil flour, and dried fruit hidden in storage pits. Then they turned to substitutes. Leather sandals were boiled into broth. Linen was shredded and steeped like tea. Wooden spoons were scraped for residue. Even straw and hay, usually reserved for animals, were soaked and chewed for hours. It didn't matter that it wasn't nourishing. It filled the mouth. It distracted the body from the ache in the gut. Mainstream historians document these famine foods with increasing alarm as the crises worsen. One particularly vivid account from the Siege of Rome by Alaric the Visigoth in 410 CE describes citizens chewing dry mortar mixed with olive oil, hoping to mimic the texture of porridge. Another speaks of women grinding pine cones into meal. A third, more gruesome, tells of rats sold for the price of a lamb. And then there's the soup, if it can be called that. Siege stew, as it was later called in a Roman jest, was a pot of boiled whatever: cabbage cores, beet greens, goat hair, crushed snails, bits of boot leather. It simmered over low fires, endlessly stirred, often shared. The taste varied depending on ingredients, but it was always bitter, always grey, and always necessary. Let's step into a crumbling insula during one such siege. A grandmother stirs a pot while her grandchildren nap nearby. The windows are boarded, the neighbours are silent. In the pot, 2 pigeon feet, some rainwater, and a chunk of what was once rope. She adds vinegar and wild mint to soften the fibres. The children won't know the difference, she hopes. And then there were the animals. At first the dogs disappeared, then the cats, then the pigeons. Urban animals became prey. People who once shooed street dogs now hunted them with stones. Horses were slaughtered in alleyways. Pets vanished from courtyards. Even sacred animals weren't safe. A temple goat could feed a block. Superstition bowed to hunger. One open scholarly debate surrounds a series of inscriptions and graffiti discovered near the Forum Boarium, Rome's ancient cattle market. Etched hastily into stone, they reference the last ox, the soup of hooves, and the horned god who fed 10. Some believe these mark a real moment in time, a final feast before starvation. Others argue they're metaphorical. Either way, they reflect a society pushed past its limits, and then, hovering at the very edge of record and rumour, there are the cannibalism stories. Roman writers, ever dramatic, sometimes hinted at them. Mothers driven mad, graves disturbed, the flesh of the dead reused. Official records are coy. The shame was too great. But clues persist. A satirical poem describes meat pies from the field of Mars. A court record accuses a man of selling uncertain sausages. A burial pit near the Aurelian walls contains human bones marked with butchery cuts. Deep slices in femurs and ribs, consistent with defleshing. No definitive proof, but the whispers remain. Let's walk into a temple courtyard. Now, a shelter. Dozens lie curled on stone floors, too weak to move. A priest moves among them, offering water and stale bread. One man clutches a cloth-wrapped object. When asked what it is, he says, "A lamb shank." But the smell is wrong. The shape, too slender. No one questions him. The emotional toll was immense. Hunger reduced citizens to scavengers. Families fell apart. Parents stole from children. Neighbours turned on each other. Order broke down. And through it all, the city's outer beauty remained. Columns still stood. Mosaics still glittered. Statues still stared impassively at the starving masses. Food became currency in its cruelest form. A single loaf could buy loyalty. A handful of barley, a bodyguard. Wine became medicinal, rationed, traded, hoarded. Even vinegar gained new value. It masked the rot. It stung the stomach into submission, and then, slowly, the sieges ended. Sometimes with relief, sometimes with ruin. Supplies returned, or invaders departed. But recovery was slow, stomachs shrunk, trust vanished. Trust. Some couldn't eat rich food again without falling ill. Others hoarded for the rest of their lives. One poet wrote of a woman who buried dried lentils in her garden every week, in case the walls close again. Yet even in this darkness, humanity flickered. Stories emerged of shared crusts, of strangers offering stew, of children giving up their portions for elders. A kind of siege solidarity. Thin, frail, but real. Here's a fringe tidbit. In some parts of the empire, siege recipes became folklore. Dishes passed down not for flavour, but for memory. In remote villages, old women taught their grandchildren how to make pine flour pancakes, bark bread, and siege broth. They laughed at the taste, but understood the lesson. Never forget. So let's end with one last kitchen. The siege is over. The fires have been rekindled. A family gathers around a clay stove. Tonight they have real food. Lentils, onions, olives, bread. The children eat eagerly. The mother adds a pinch of salt, then pauses. From a sack in the corner, she pulls out a strip of boiled leather, just in case, because Rome never forgot what it tasted like to starve. To chew wood, to boil shoes, to eye your neighbour's meal, and wonder if it had once spoken. And so, amid the city's grandeur, a quiet truth lingered like the smell of old soup. Even the mighty must sometimes swallow their pride, and sometimes much worse. Dawn creeps into the ruins of what was once the Forum, casting long slanted beams over cracked marble and weedy crevices. Rome has changed. The empire has fractured. The emperors have faded into bronze busts and chiselled names, and yet something remains. Not the legions, not the glory, but the food, or rather, the ghosts of it. The echoes of what people once swallowed, cooked, begged for, choked on, and sometimes died without. Rome's revolting, brilliant, stubbornly inventive cuisine has outlived the civilization itself. Today, when you bite into a savoury anchovy-laced pasta, or drizzle olive oil over crusty bread, or sip bitter wine beside a dish of olives, you are, in some ghostly way, communing with ancient Romans. Because while the empire's borders shrank, its tastes remained, simmered down and salted across generations. And the legacy includes more than just flavours. It includes the sheer, undeniable fact that people ate to survive, even when the ingredients would make your modern stomach recoil. Let's rewind one last time. Not to a grand banquet or a breadline, but to a humble kitchen in Ostia. A woman grinds chickpeas in a bowl, mixing them with herbs grown in broken amphorae out back. Her children help her knead the paste into small cakes. They fry them over a flickering flame, turning them crisp and golden. There's no meat, no cheese, not even garlic, just beans and salt and hunger turned into habit. That dish, centuries later, might remind you of falafel, or a simple croquette. It's all connected. The Roman Empire's foodways weren't just transmitted through conquest or cultural exchange. They filtered downward, sideways, through kitchens and markets, through the hands of slaves, soldiers, widows and orphans. A Roman cook in Alexandria blended cumin and fish sauce. A legionnaire in Britain learned to roast barley cakes over a damp fire. A Gallic villager preserved goat milk by accident and created a sour cheese still made today. These were not chefs, they were survivors. Mainstream historical accounts confirm that Roman culinary practices influenced everything from medieval monastic diets to Renaissance banquets. Salted fish, a staple, bread baked in round loaves with cuts across the top, straight from Pompeii's ovens. Even the tradition of stuffing, meats, vegetables or sweets, traces back to the pages of Apicius. But the influence isn't just in what we inherited, it's in what we remember. The weird, the terrible, the creatively disgusting. Consider garum, Rome's infamous fermented fish sauce. For centuries it vanished from Western kitchens. Too pungent, too exotic. Yet in recent decades, a quiet culinary revival has brought it back. This time under the chic label of Colatura di Alici, served in gourmet Italian restaurants. Same process, same smell, slightly nicer bottle. Or take Maritum, the garlicky cheese herb paste spread on bread by poor farmers. It's now recognisable as a cousin to pesto, minus the pine nuts, minus the flair, but every bit as Roman. Even garbanzo beans, fava puree, flatbreads, mulled wine. All these cling to the Mediterranean palate because Rome clung to them first. Despite drought, invasion, religious reform, plague and collapse, some flavours were just too stubborn to die. Here's a quirky fact. The average Roman poor person might not have recognised the modern versions of their survival meals, but they'd certainly recognise the principles. Stretch what you have, mask rot with vinegar. Cook everything twice, never waste an onion. One open, scholarly debate still lingers over the emotional role of Roman food. Was it purely functional for the poor, or did even the simplest meals carry moments of joy? While archaeological digs often focus on caloric content, some scholars point to communal cooking areas, traces of honey, and even decorative pottery as signs that food wasn't just about survival. It was, when possible, about pleasure. Even when the ingredients were vile, even when they weren't food at all. Let's revisit some of Rome's worst offenders, not to disgust, but to marvel. Fish sauce that burned the nostrils and outlived empires. Bread made with ground-up bones and charcoal. Flamingo tongues. Mouldy barley mixed with goat dung. Yes, for medicinal reasons. Rats roasted and served with pepper. Bricks boiled in desperation. Bark soup. Pigeon feet porridge. All real. All eaten. Because to be Roman, especially a Roman without coin or title, was to improvise. And that improvisation, that stubborn resistance to starvation, created its own cultural foundation, not of luxury but of adaptability, one that modern chefs tap into more often than they realise. today's obsession with nose-to-tail eating. Rome did it out of necessity. Nothing went to waste. Brains, lungs, intestines, marrow and more, all repurposed, reimagined, revered in some cases. Street food? Romans loved it. Bread, beans, fried cheese, meat skewers, all eaten on the go, often standing in alleys or under awnings. Even diet trends owe the empire a nod. Intermittent fasting. Romans did it regularly when food ran out. Fermented vegetables and probiotic-rich condiments. Standard practice. Plant-based meats like mushroom loaves or lentil sausages. Not a TikTok trend. A centuries-old solution to meat scarcity. Yet the darkest legacy may be this. The memory of what starvation does to a society. When the rich feast on sea urchins and peacock brains, while the poor boil bark and bury their dead with breadcrumbs. When a city can light torches for festivals while its tenements turn to dust. When food becomes both symbol and weapon. And Rome, in all its splendour, never figured out how to balance the plate. So where does that leave us, sitting comfortably on full stomachs, listening from the safety of centuries away? It leaves us humbled, in awe of the resilience baked into every gritty loaf, of the endurance stirred into every sour soup, of the ingenuity required to turn rot into a ritual and starvation into a story. The story of Rome isn't just marble and empire, it's gruel, it's fish paste, it's bean mash and goat guts and water stolen from fountains to boil dandelions. It's a city where people survived by eating things you'd turn your nose at, and somehow made some of it stick, into recipes, into cultures, into who we are now. So tonight maybe skip the flamingo tongue, maybe skip, but pour a little oil on your bread. Taste the vinegar, think of garum, and remember, you're part of the story too. The fire flickers low, casting soft gold against the crumbling frescoes of an imagined Roman kitchen. The rush of the city has quieted now. The clatter of amphora, the rustle of grain sacks, even the whispered bartering over scraps. It all fades into the warm hush of memory. You've wandered through alleyways of garlicky steam and vinegar sting, down market stalls sagging with the grotesque and the glorious, across the rooftops where smoke from bark bread once curled toward empty bellies. You've heard the groans of overfull nobles reclining after eel pudding, and the hollow stillness of mothers chewing leather beside sleeping children. This wasn't a story about heroes or glory. It was a story about grit, about people who didn't have the luxury of taste, who seasoned with ash and hope and whatever they could scrounge before the sun went down. People who, in a world of excess and opulence, still found ways to keep their families alive. One chipped bowl of gruel at a time. So, let the images drift now. Leave behind the stew of strange bones and beetle bread. Let your breath slow, your mind soften. There are no more sieges, no more salted rats or whispered myths about meat pies made from... Well, never mind. You're safe, warm, full. The Romans, somehow, made it through, and now, so have you. Sleep well, dream lightly, and maybe tomorrow be grateful for your fridge, or for